Hey there, 39 books, 1,000 years, kings, floods, giants, even a talking donkey. Most people think it is a random pile of stories they half slept through in Sunday school. Plot twist, it is one story, chasing one promise from the first page to the last. Tonight we draw the whole thing as a map, a road with towering peaks and brutal pits. It opens in a perfect garden, crashes into a burning city, and lands on a faint whisper of hope. You will see where Moses came from, how a shepherd boy grabbed a crown, and why this saga ends on the wildest cliffhanger in history. By the time the credits roll, the whole Old Testament will snap into place inside your head as one clean, connected map. And trust me, you will never look at that giant book the same way again. So before we take off, drop it down in the comments. What city are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it where you are right now? I want to know who's along for the ride. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us roll. Before we set a single foot inside that perfect garden, we need a map of the map. Think of it like showing up at a gigantic theme park and grabbing the little folded brochure at the gate. Skip that step and you spend the whole day wandering in circles, wondering why you keep ending up back at the parking lot. So let us take 2 minutes to get the lay of the land, and then nobody gets lost. The Old Testament, at least in most Christian Bibles, is not really a book. It is a library of 39 separate books, written by different people across a staggering span of time, then bound together into one volume thick enough to prop open a heavy door. Those 39 books are sorted into 4 big neighborhoods. The first is the Law, also called the Pentateuch, which is just a dressed-up Greek word meaning 5 books. Then comes history, a long stretch of kings, wars, and dynasties rising and falling. After that comes poetry and wisdom, the section where the whole thing slows down to talk about pain, love, doubt, and the meaning of it all. And finally, the prophets, the loud ones, the people who kept showing up to tell everybody exactly what they did not want to hear. 4 neighborhoods, 39 books. Hold on to that. One thing worth flagging right away is that these 4 neighborhoods are organized by type, not by timeline. The books are grouped the way a bookstore groups its shelves, all the history over here, all the poetry over there, rather than lined up in the strict order events actually happened. That means a poem written by a particular king can sit hundreds of pages after the history book describing his reign, so if you ever crack the thing open and feel like the chronology is hopping around at random, that is not you losing the thread. It is simply the filing system, and once you know the shelves are there, the apparent chaos turns out to be perfectly tidy. It is also worth knowing what these texts were originally written in. The overwhelming majority of the Old Testament was composed in ancient Hebrew, with a handful of later passages in a closely related language called Aramaic, which was the common tongue across the wider region for a stretch of this history. None of it was written in English, obviously, which means every version you have ever read is a translation. A few of the famous phrases we are going to meet along the way carry shades of meaning in the original that no single English word quite captures. Worth keeping in the back of your mind whenever a line sounds slightly strange. Sometimes that is just the translation stretching to hold something a little bigger than it can comfortably fit. Here is where it gets mildly confusing, so stay with me. The Hebrew Bible, called the Tanakh, contains the exact same texts, every single word, but counts them as only 24 books instead of 39. Same content, different arithmetic. The trick is that the Hebrew tradition bundles things together that the Christian arrangement splits apart. What ends up as 2 books of Samuel is kept as one, same story with Kings, same story with Chronicles. And the 12 short prophetic books at the very back, which we will meet much later, get rolled up into a single tidy scroll simply called the 12. Fewer books, identical story. It is a bit like the difference between counting a box set as 12 episodes or as 1 season. The show does not change, only the label on the spine does. That name Tanakh is itself just a shortcut, stitched together from the first letters of its 3 sections. Torah, the teaching or law. Nevi'im, the prophets. Ketuvim, the writings. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and you take the leading sounds and get Tanakh. The ancient world, as it happens, loved a good acronym almost as much as a modern office does. Those first 5 books, the Pentateuch, carry an enormous amount of weight for their size. They run to 187 chapters, which is roughly a fifth of the entire Old Testament. So before we have met a single king or heard a single prophet raise his voice, 1 out of every 5 pages is already behind us. These 5 books are the bedrock, and everything that comes afterward is built on top of them, which is exactly why we are starting here rather than skipping ahead to the exciting parts. Now for the skeleton, the single idea that holds this sprawling library upright. If you remember nothing else from this whole section, remember one word: covenant. A covenant is basically a binding agreement, a contract with teeth, a solemn promise sealed between two parties with real consequences on the line. The entire Old Testament runs on a chain of these covenants made between God and humanity, and every link in that chain nudges the story forward. There is one made with the first man, Adam, another with Noah, the flood survivor, a hugely important one with Abraham, the wandering old man we are about to meet. Then one with Moses, the reluctant shepherd. Then one with David, the shepherd who became a king. And hovering over all of them, the promise of a brand new covenant still to come. The genuinely clever part is the pattern these covenants make when you line them up. Each one narrows the focus, like a camera slowly zooming in on a single point. The earliest promises are aimed at all of humanity, every person on earth without exception. Then the lens tightens to one particular family. Then that family swells into one particular nation. Then the focus tightens again, down to a single royal bloodline, one specific dynasty of kings. And out of that shrinking funnel, the story keeps insisting, will eventually step one particular person, a promised king who repairs everything that went wrong all the way back at the beginning. All of humanity, down to a nation, down to a family, down to a throne, down to a single figure. The aperture keeps closing until it lands on one point of light. Keep that funnel in your head because it is the shape of the whole story. While we are busy clearing up confusion, let me kill a myth before it can even form. Later on, you're going to hear about major prophets and minor prophets, and it would be the most natural thing in the world to assume the major ones are the important heavyweights and the minor ones are the understudies waiting in the wings. That's completely wrong. The labels have absolutely nothing to do with importance and everything to do with page count. The major prophets simply wrote longer books. The minor prophets wrote shorter ones. That is the entire difference, start to finish. A so-called minor prophet can deliver a line that shakes the foundations of the world in 21 verses, while a major prophet takes 66 chapters to arrive at his point. Think of it as the gap between a novel and a short story. Nobody sensible thinks the short story matters less, it is just shorter. As for time, let me hand you a rough sense of scale so the road ahead has some proportion to it. The recorded history of this nation, from the moment it becomes a recognizable people to the moment it finally trudges home from exile, stretches across something like 400 to 500 years. And that is before you even add the ancient prehistory that sits in front of it, the garden and the flood and all that deep time material where the numbers grow genuinely enormous and people supposedly live for centuries. So when we say 1,000 years of story, we are not inflating the figure for dramatic effect. This is a very, very long road, and we are about to walk the entire length of it. Consider this section your compass. From here on, whenever you feel yourself getting lost, just picture the 4 neighborhoods and the shrinking funnel of covenants, and you will always know roughly where you are standing. With the map folded neatly into our back pocket, we can finally step onto the road itself. And fittingly, the road begins at the beginning, with a book whose name literally means beginning. Genesis. Genesis is the opening act, and it does an astonishing amount of heavy lifting for a single book. Almost every major thread that the rest of the Bible will spend the next 1,000 years tugging on gets its first knot tied right here. If the Old Testament were a long-running television series, Genesis would be the pilot episode that quietly plants every plot point the writers plan to cash in on for the next 10 seasons. Blink and you miss half of them. It opens sensibly with creation. God speaks and a world takes shape one piece at a time, unfolding over a rhythm of days. First light is separated from darkness, then the sky, then dry land, shoulders its way up out of the sea, then plants, then the sun and moon and stars, then the fish and the birds, then the land animals, and finally, as the crowning act, people. And then, notably, rest. On the 7th day, the work stops entirely, and that single detail, a day deliberately set aside for rest, echoes forward into the weekly calendar that a huge slice of the planet still quietly runs onto this day. Not a bad legacy for one short passage. The first two humans, Adam and Eve, are placed in a garden called Eden, and this is one of the rarest scenes in the entire library, so take a good long look while it lasts. Everything is in perfect harmony. Nothing is broken, nothing hurts, nobody is hiding anything from anybody. Humanity and God share the same space with no distance between them at all. Enjoy the view because it does not hold for long. In fact, it lasts roughly as long as it takes to introduce a single rule. The rule could not be simpler. There is one tree in the garden whose fruit is off limits, and only one. You can probably guess where this is going because it is the oldest observation about human nature ever recorded. Tell a person they may have everything except one thing, and suddenly that one thing is all they can think about. A serpent slides into the scene with a very smooth sales pitch. The fruit gets eaten, and the consequences arrive on schedule. Shame, then blame, then a curse, then exile. The first humans are escorted out of the garden, and the gate shuts behind them. But folded inside that disaster is the very first flicker of the promise that will drive absolutely everything from here on. It is a cryptic little line that one day a descendant of the woman, the seed of the woman as the ancient text phrases it, will crush the source of all this trouble underfoot. It is vague, it is brief, and it is the seed of the entire story. Tuck it away. That whole 1,000-year chase we keep mentioning kicks off with that one sentence, delivered almost in passing. From there, humanity does what humanity does best, which is escalate. In the very next generation, jealousy between two brothers, Cain and Abel, curdles into the first murder in human history. Give people a single generation outside paradise, and they have already invented sibling rivalry with a body count. And things keep sliding downhill. The human race grows more and more corrupt until, in one of the broadest strokes in the whole book, God decides to hit the reset button with a great flood. One family is spared, an old man named Noah, along with his relatives, and a floating wooden zoo stocked with breeding pairs of every kind of animal. They ride out the deluge, and when the rain finally lets up, Noah begins releasing birds to test whether the flood has drained away, until at last a dove flutters back carrying a fresh olive leaf, the original all-clear signal that dry land has surfaced somewhere out there. The waters eventually withdraw, and humanity is handed a clean slate along with a promise, sealed with a rainbow, that the world will never be wiped out this way again. It is the ancient equivalent of switching the whole thing off and back on again, and for a brief window, it even seems to work. For a brief window, because people, being people, soon gather to build a tower tall enough to scrape the heavens and make a great name for themselves, a monument to their own cleverness. God is distinctly unimpressed with the architecture. Rather than let the project reach the top, he scrambles their single shared language into many, so that suddenly none of the builders can understand a word their neighbors are saying. Construction grinds to a halt the way any project does, the moment nobody on the team can read the same set of instructions. The people scatter across the earth, and that scattering, the book tells us, is where the world's many languages and nations come from. The tower is remembered as Babel, and it stands as the origin story for every group project that has ever collapsed under the weight of poor communication. Then, right when the story could easily wander off into an endless list of who was descended from whom, it suddenly zooms in tight on one man. This is the narrowing funnel we talked about, engaging for the very first time. Around 4,000 years ago, God approaches an elderly man named Abraham, at this point still going by Abram, and makes him an offer most people his age would politely decline. Leave your homeland, pack up your entire life, and travel to a country called Canaan that you have never so much as seen, on nothing but the strength of a promise. And what a promise it is, that this childless old man will somehow become the father of a great nation, and that through his descendants every family on the face of the earth will be blessed. There is one modest logistical hiccup, which is that Abraham and his wife Sarah have no children, and are both comfortably past the usual age for starting a family. Naturally, this is exactly the kind of impossible arithmetic the story delights in. The waiting, it should be said, is not brief. Years drag by with no child, and at one point, when God repeats the promise to the elderly couple, Sarah actually laughs out loud at the sheer absurdity of it, which is a very human reaction to being told you will be starting a family several decades after everyone your age has finished. There is a lovely little detail tucked inside this, because when the long-promised son finally does arrive, he is given a name that means laughter, a permanent and rather affectionate reminder of the day his mother chuckled at the impossible. Along the way, God also spells out the scale of the promise in dizzying terms, telling Abraham his descendants will one day be as countless as the stars overhead, and formally seals the whole thing as a lasting covenant. The same kind of binding agreement we met earlier, tying the single family to the much larger plan. Against every reasonable expectation, the promise starts coming true. A son, Isaac, is born to the elderly couple, and everything from now on rides on this one child, which is precisely what makes the next episode so difficult to sit through. In the book's most wrenching scene, God asks Abraham to take his long-awaited son up a mountain and offer him up as a sacrifice. Astonishingly, Abraham obeys and walks the boy up the slope, right up until the final possible moment, when his hand is stopped and a ram is provided to take the child's place. It is a harrowing test of trust, and the point of it is that the promise survives. Isaac lives, the bloodline continues, and the funnel narrows one notch further. The promise passes down to Isaac's son Jacob, who is, to put it as gently as possible, a handful. Jacob is a schemer and a trickster, a man who cons his way into a blessing that was never meant for him, and then spends a good chunk of his youth running from the fallout. He is not the spotless hero you might expect to carry a sacred bloodline, and honestly, that is the whole idea. This story keeps deliberately choosing flawed, complicated, deeply human people over polished ones. One night, in a genuinely strange episode, Jacob wrestles a mysterious figure until the sun comes up, refusing to let go until he is given a blessing. He walks away from the match with a permanent limp and a brand new name, Israel. That name is a very big deal because it goes on to become the name of the entire nation. So every time you hear Israel from this point forward, remember it started life as the new nickname of a reformed con man who once out-wrestled the divine to a draw. Those years on the run were eventful in their own right. Early in his flight, Jacob fell asleep out in the open with a stone for a pillow and dreamed of a great stairway rising all the way to the heavens with messengers moving up and down it. A vision that reassured him the promise handed down from his grandfather now rested on his shoulders too. He ended up working for a relative named Laban, a man every bit as cunning as Jacob himself, which made for a wonderfully petty rivalry between two schemers. Jacob agreed to labor 7 years in exchange for the woman he loved, only to be tricked on the wedding night into marrying her older sister instead, and then had to grind out another 7 years to finally marry the woman he had wanted all along. The lifelong con man had, at last, been thoroughly out-conned, which the story seems to find as satisfying as we do. Between his wives and their servants, Jacob's household grew and grew, and it is out of this crowded, tangled family that his many sons emerge. Those sons number 12 in all, and they go on to become the 12 tribes that make up the entire nation. But before we get there, one final Genesis story deserves the spotlight, because it is one of the best in the whole library. Jacob has an obvious favorite among his boys, a young man named Joseph, and he makes not the slightest effort to hide it, going so far as to give the lad a spectacular coat that his brothers correctly read as a public announcement of the favoritism. As if the coat were not provocation enough, Joseph also had a habit of sharing his dreams out loud at the dinner table, and his dreams carried an awkward recurring theme, namely his entire family bowing down low before him. Informing your older brothers that you have foreseen them one day kneeling at your feet is not, historically speaking, a proven strategy for winning them over. Favoritism plus a pack of siblings is a recipe for disaster in any century, and this is no exception. The brothers, sick with jealousy, seize their opportunity and sell Joseph into slavery, then go home and tell their grieving father the boy is dead. Joseph is dragged off to Egypt with nothing to his name but the coat on his back, and probably not even that for long. And here the story pulls off its favorite maneuver, which is quietly turning a catastrophe into a setup. In Egypt, Joseph is sold into the household of a powerful official, quietly works his way up until he is running the entire estate, and is then falsely accused of a serious crime by the official's wife after he refuses her advances, a betrayal that drops him straight into prison for years. It is a run of misfortune that would flatten most people permanently. But he has a rare gift for interpreting dreams, and when the ruler of Egypt, the Pharaoh, is rattled by dreams that none of his advisors can explain, Joseph is hauled out of his cell and summoned. He reads the dreams as a warning, 7 years of overflowing abundance, followed immediately by 7 years of devastating famine. Impressed, Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of preparing the entire country for the lean years ahead, which he does by stockpiling grain all through the 7 fat years, so that when the famine finally bites, Egypt alone among its neighbors has storehouses that are full to the rafters. In practical terms, this means a foreign ex-prisoner has just been promoted to the second most powerful position in the kingdom, more or less overnight. It is the sort of career leap that would make any modern life coach quietly weep with envy. When the famine finally lands, it spreads far beyond Egypt's borders and reaches, of all people, the very family that once threw Joseph away. His brothers, hungry and desperate, travel to Egypt to beg for grain, without the faintest idea that the imposing official they are bowing down to is the brother they betrayed all those years earlier. Joseph recognizes them at once, and after testing them, after a great deal of emotional back and forth, he does the thing absolutely nobody expects. He forgives them. He reveals who he really is, breaks down in tears, and brings his entire family down to Egypt to ride out the famine in comfort and safety. Genesis closes on this warm note, with the whole household of Israel, Jacob and his 12 sons and all their families, settled snugly in Egypt, alive, reunited, and well-fed. It is a genuinely happy ending, which, if you have been paying any attention to how this particular library operates, should make you just slightly nervous, because that cozy little family in Egypt is about to swell into a very large population in Egypt, and the next book opens precisely at the point where comfortable becomes the very last word anyone would use. Because here is what a happy ending actually means in these pages. It is a countdown. Genesis shuts with a favored family living the good life as honored guests of a grateful Pharaoh. Exodus opens roughly 400 years down the line, and the welcome mat has been well and truly rolled up and put in storage. Across those 4 centuries, the descendants of Jacob did exactly what the promise had guaranteed. They multiplied and kept right on multiplying until they had grown from a single household into an enormous nation living inside Egypt. Which sounds like marvelous news until you consider it from the Egyptian point of view, watching a foreign people balloon in number and growing steadily more uneasy about it. A new pharaoh eventually came to power who, in the book's pointed phrasing, did not know Joseph. All that gratitude toward the man who had once saved the entire country from starvation had faded into distant, dusty history, filed away and forgotten. This new ruler looked at the swelling population and saw not neighbors but a threat, and his solution was to grind them down into slavery. The people who had arrived generations earlier as honored guests were now forced labor, sweating under the Egyptian sun, and their comfortable chapter was firmly over. But mere slavery was not enough for the anxious pharaoh. Terrified that the population would keep on growing regardless, he issued a horrifying decree aimed at reducing their numbers by targeting their newborn sons. It is against this grim backdrop that our next leading character makes his entrance. And what an entrance it is, practically staged for the screen. One mother, desperate to save her infant boy, hid him at home for as long as she possibly could, then placed him in a waterproof basket and set him gently adrift on the river Nile, trusting the current to carry him toward anything safer than where he was. The river carried him straight to the one person in all Egypt capable of protecting him, Pharaoh's own daughter, who found the basket among the reeds, took pity on the crying baby, and raised him as her own son inside the royal palace. And so the child who would one day bring the entire Egyptian empire to its knees grew up as a prince of Egypt, dining at the table of the very household that wanted his people erased. The irony was lost on nobody, least of all the story itself. His name was Moses. Moses grew up straddling 2 worlds, an Egyptian prince by upbringing and a member of the enslaved people by blood, and eventually that tension snapped. One day he witnessed an Egyptian brutalizing one of the slaves, stepped in, and killed the man, then hurriedly buried the body in the sand, hoping no one had been watching. Someone had. With the secret out and Pharaoh now wanting his head, the prince became a fugitive overnight, fleeing into the wilderness and trading a palace for the life of a shepherd in the absolute middle of nowhere. For the next 40 years he tended sheep in the desert, and by every appearance that was the quiet end of his story, a former prince slowly growing old among the livestock, his royal past nothing more than a fading memory. Then came the bush. Out with his flock on an otherwise ordinary day, Moses spotted something impossible. A bush that was on fire yet somehow refused to burn up, blazing away without being consumed. Understandably curious, he wandered over for a closer look, and from within the flames came a voice. It was God, and the assignment on offer was not a small one. Go back to Egypt, the very place you fled for your life, march into Pharaoh's court, and demand the release of an entire enslaved nation. Moses, quite reasonably, was less than thrilled by this particular career opportunity and rolled out a whole series of excuses. He was not a good speaker, nobody would believe him. Surely there was somebody, anybody, better suited to the role. Every excuse was calmly overruled. Though as a small concession, God appointed Moses' brother Aaron to travel alongside him and handle much of the actual talking, a sensible arrangement for a man who kept insisting he was hopeless with words. And so a deeply reluctant 80-year-old shepherd set off to confront the most powerful man in the known world, which is not a resume anyone would have drawn up on purpose. What followed was a long battle of wills between Moses, speaking on God's behalf, and Pharaoh, who had absolutely no intention of surrendering his free workforce. Every time Moses demanded freedom for the people, Pharaoh refused, and every refusal brought a fresh disaster crashing down on Egypt. 10 of them in total, each worse than the last. The river turned to blood. Then came a plague of frogs, then swarms of gnats and biting flies, then disease sweeping through the livestock, then painful sores, then a ruinous hailstorm, then locusts that stripped bare whatever the hail had missed, then a darkness so thick and total it could practically be felt with the hands. 9 catastrophes, and still Pharaoh would not bend, hardening his heart the moment each round of pressure let up. It took a 10th and final blow to break him at last. Each disaster, it is worth noting, tended to strike at something the Egyptians held sacred: their river, their sun, their livestock, as if the whole grim contest were quietly demonstrating that the gods they trusted in could not shield them from any of it. And Pharaoh throughout was maddeningly inconsistent, solemnly promising to release the people the instant a plague grew unbearable, then flatly reversing himself the moment relief arrived. It was the ancient equivalent of agreeing to absolutely anything while you have a raging toothache, and forgetting every word of it the second the pain fades. That final plague was the most sorrowful of them all, the loss of the firstborn son in every household across Egypt. But the enslaved people were given away to be spared, to be passed over. Each family was instructed to mark the doorframes of their homes with the blood of a lamb, and wherever that mark appeared, the household inside would be left untouched. This is the origin of the festival called Passover, named for exactly that, the sparing, the passing over of the marked homes. Keep this lamb somewhere in the back of your mind, because the image of a blood-marked doorway and a household spared from harm is one of those quiet threads the larger story will reach back and pull on again much further down the line. For now, simply note that it worked. The meal shared that night was eaten in a tremendous hurry, with bread baked so quickly there was no time to let it rise, a small practical detail that would be deliberately remembered and repeated for centuries afterward every time the festival came back around. That night finally shattered Pharaoh's resistance, and he told the people to leave. So they left, an entire nation walking out of slavery in the space of a single night, carrying whatever they could grab and moving fast before Pharaoh had a chance to reconsider. Which, of course, he promptly did. Almost as soon as they had gone, the Egyptian ruler bitterly regretted losing his labor force and sent his army, chariots and all, thundering after them. The escaping people soon found themselves pinned between the approaching soldiers behind them and a wide sea directly in front of them, which is roughly the worst position a fleeing crowd can be in and would spell the end of nearly any escape story. And then came the moment this book is arguably most famous for. The sea itself split wide open, the waters drawing back to leave a dry path straight down the middle, and the people crossed to the far shore on solid ground. When the Egyptian army charged in after them onto that same path, the waters collapsed back into place behind the last of the escapees. The pursuit was over. The nation was free, and there was no road back. Freedom, though, turns out to be a very different thing from arriving. What waited on the other side of that sea was not the promised homeland, but a vast, empty wilderness, and the people would spend the next 40 years wandering across it. This was no scenic weekend hike. It was 4 full decades in the desert, and the practical challenge of feeding and guiding an entire nation through a wasteland was staggering. The story addresses it with a pair of ongoing wonders. By day, a towering pillar of cloud moved ahead of the people to lead the way. By night, that same pillar became a column of fire, offering both direction and light in the dark. And when the food inevitably ran out, a mysterious flaky substance began appearing on the ground each morning, which the people gathered up and ate. They called it manna, a word that translates roughly to the baffled question, "What is it?" which is a wonderfully honest name for a food that nobody could quite identify. The people, for their part, were not always gracious about any of this. They grumbled almost constantly, complained bitterly about the menu, and more than once announced that slavery back in Egypt had honestly been more comfortable than freedom, which must have been an exhausting thing to hear from a crowd you had just gone to enormous lengths to rescue. When they were desperate with thirst and there was no water in sight, it was supplied from the least likely source imaginable, drawn straight out of a solid rock. The wandering was, in short, one long exercise in an entire nation learning to trust that it would be provided for, and then promptly forgetting the lesson at the first sign of hardship. The centerpiece of all this wandering unfolded at a mountain called Sinai. Moses climbed it while the entire mountain trembled beneath him, wrapped in thunder, smoke, and fire, a display dramatic enough to leave no doubt whatsoever that something enormous was taking place. At the summit, he received the foundation of the entire law, most famously the 10 Commandments, a compact list of core rules carved onto stone tablets. But those 10 were only the headline. Alongside them came a vast and detailed body of law, 613 commands in all, covering everything from worship and justice to diet and daily conduct. This was the moment a loose crowd of freed slaves was formally handed the framework meant to shape it into an ordered nation with God at its very center. It was, in effect, the founding paperwork of an entire people, delivered on a mountaintop. There was, however, a problem, and it arrived at the worst imaginable moment. While Moses was up on the mountain receiving all of this, including rather pointedly a firm command against worshiping false gods, the people waiting at the bottom grew restless. He had been gone quite a while, and their patience simply ran out. So they collected their gold, melted it down, cast it into the shape of a calf, and began worshiping the very object they had just finished manufacturing. The timing could hardly have been worse. The ink was barely dry on the rule against doing exactly this, and they had already broken it at the foot of the very mountain where it was being written. Moses, coming back down the slope to find the celebration in full swing, was furious enough to smash the stone tablets on the spot, which is a fairly emphatic way to make a point about an agreement being shattered. It is a spectacular display of impatience, and it establishes a pattern that will repeat throughout the rest of the story with almost clockwork reliability. Rescue, gratitude, boredom, betrayal, and then rescue all over again. Exodus does not leave us on that low note, though. It closes, of all things, with a construction project. Following a set of detailed instructions, the people built something called the tabernacle, an elaborate and richly decorated tent designed to serve as the dwelling place of God's presence among them. Portable is the key word here, because unlike a permanent temple fixed forever to one spot, this was a sacred structure that could be packed up and carried as the nation kept moving through the wilderness. At the very heart of it sat a gold-covered chest known as the Ark, which held the stone tablets of the law and served as the focal point of God's presence among the people. A detail well worth filing away, because that particular chest is going to matter a great deal further down the road. And that is the quietly moving idea the book leaves us with. Remember that perfect garden all the way back at the very start where God and humanity shared the same space with no distance between them? The tabernacle is the first real step toward getting that back, a way for God to live once again in the middle of his people, even in the chaos of a desert, even among a crowd that had just proven it could forget a promise in roughly the time it takes to melt down some jewelry. The distance that opened up the moment the garden gates swung shut begins, ever so slightly, to close. And so, with a nation newly freed, freshly given its laws, and now traveling with the presence of God pitched in a tent at the dead center of the camp, everything is finally in place for the next long stretch of road, the complicated, messy, and frequently bloody business of actually reaching the land they were promised. Before any marching or conquering can begin, the story does something that has quietly torpedoed more well-meaning reading plans than almost any other stretch of the Bible. It slams the brakes on the action and spends 2 entire books on rules, rituals, and record-keeping. These are Leviticus and Numbers, and they arrive with a certain reputation. If you have ever known someone who decided, brimming with resolve on the 1st of January, to finally read the whole Bible from cover to cover, there is an excellent chance their grand ambition quietly expired somewhere in the middle of Leviticus, buried under a landslide of instructions about animal fat, mildew, and skin conditions. It is nobody's idea of a page-turner, and that is putting it about as kindly as it can be put. But it is worth saying clearly, right at the outset, because it completely changes how these books read. Neither of them is filler. They are the operating manual for everything that has just been assembled. Skip them, and the rest of the story quietly loses a great deal of its meaning. A bit like walking into the middle of a complicated board game and refusing to so much as glance at the rulebook, then wondering why nothing anyone does seems to make the slightest sense. The instructions are dull precisely because they are instructions. That does not make them optional. Leviticus picks up on the exact spot where we left off, with that portable tent freshly assembled and the presence of God now camped squarely in the middle of the people. And that arrangement raises an immediate, genuinely serious problem, which is the entire reason the book exists. If a perfect and holy God has just moved into the center of a camp packed with thoroughly imperfect people, how is that supposed to work without everything going spectacularly wrong at the first opportunity? Leviticus is the long, detailed answer to that single question, and its answer, broadly, is a system. A carefully worked out set of procedures for how deeply flawed people can live in close quarters with something overwhelmingly holy and actually survive the experience. The beating heart of that system is sacrifice, and there is no getting around the fact that it is not a subject for the squeamish. The underlying logic is stark and completely consistent. Wrongdoing carries a cost. That cost is death, and rather than the guilty person paying it directly, an animal is offered in their place. Blood is spilled so that the human does not have to be. This is the principle of substitution, one life standing in for another, and it runs through the entire book in exhaustive detail, with different offerings carefully prescribed for different situations and different kinds of failure. To modern ears, the whole arrangement can sound grim and more than a little alien, and it was certainly not a system designed with vegetarians in mind, but the idea sitting underneath it is one the larger story cares about enormously. Keep the concept somewhere in the back of your mind, this notion of an innocent life given in place of a guilty one, because much like that blood-marked doorway from the previous book, it is a thread the story fully intends to reach back and pull on again a long way down the line. There is one more thing worth noticing about this whole sacrificial system, and it is easy to overlook while you are lost in the fine print of which animal suits which occasion. The offerings never actually finished the job. They had to be repeated endlessly, day after day and year after year, because each one only ever dealt with the moment at hand and never with the deeper problem for good. It was less a cure than an ongoing course of treatment, a maintenance plan that had to be renewed forever with no end in sight. And that very endlessness, that nagging sense of a temporary fix repeated without stopping, quietly plants a longing that the larger story will eventually promise to answer with something permanent. For now, though, the animals keep coming and the system grinds steadily on. To actually run all of this, you need staff, and so Leviticus formally establishes a priesthood. Aaron, the brother we last saw doing much of Moses' talking for him, is set apart along with his sons to serve as the priests, the designated go-betweens who handle the offerings and manage the sacred space on everyone else's behalf. It was a role that carried considerable prestige and, as it swiftly turns out, considerable risk, because the book wastes very little time demonstrating just how seriously the whole arrangement took itself. In one genuinely chilling episode, two of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, offer fire in a manner they were never authorized to, an improvised bit of freelancing with the ritual, and they are struck down on the spot. It is a stark and sobering scene, and its purpose within the book is unmistakable. This is not a casual, take-it-or-leave-it arrangement, and holiness is not something to be approached carelessly or cheerfully improvised around. The message, delivered without a shred of subtlety, is that the God now living in the middle of the camp is emphatically not a mascot. The priesthood also came bundled with an unmistakable dress code. The high priest in particular wore an elaborate set of garments loaded with meaning, including a breastpiece set with 12 precious stones, one for each tribe, so that whenever he stepped into the sacred space, he carried the entire nation on his chest, quite literally representing all of them at once. It was a role that blended solemn responsibility with a fair amount of ceremonial finery, and it underscored just how carefully mediated the whole relationship between the people and the holiness at their center had to be. Nobody, priest or otherwise, simply wandered in off the street. From there, Leviticus branches out into the vast and tangled territory of what counts as clean and what counts as unclean. And this is the part that tends to baffle newcomers most thoroughly. There are painstakingly detailed laws about food, most famously the dietary restrictions that rule certain animals off the menu entirely, which is broadly the origin point of the kosher tradition that many people still keep to this day. There are laws about disease, about mold creeping across the walls of a house, about all manner of ordinary bodily conditions, each one carefully sorted into the categories of clean or unclean. To a modern reader idly flipping through, a great deal of it can look like an oddly specific ancient health code crossed with a very restrictive dinner menu. But threaded through every last regulation is one organizing idea, repeated like a steady drumbeat. The people are to be holy, set apart, visibly different, because the God they belong to is holy. That single instruction, to be holy because God himself is holy, is the true center of gravity of the entire book. Everything else, the offerings, the food rules, the endless fussy distinctions, quietly orbits around that one demand to be a people who stand out. There is one ritual in Leviticus that deserves singling out because its influence reaches well beyond the page and straight into everyday language. Once a year, on the single most solemn day of the entire calendar, the whole nation's accumulated wrongdoing was dealt with in one great ceremony. 2 goats were brought forward. One was offered as a sacrifice in the usual way. The other, in a striking piece of ritual theater, had the sins of the entire people symbolically laid upon its head before it was driven out alive into the wilderness, carrying all that guilt away with it into the empty distance. That second animal was the original scapegoat, and yes, that is precisely where the modern word comes from. Every time someone today grumbles about being made the scapegoat for a mess that was never really theirs, they are unknowingly quoting an ancient ceremony involving an actual goat and a very long walk into the desert. Leviticus also lays out the nation's calendar of sacred festivals, a yearly rhythm of feasts and observances, including one in which the people were to live for a full week in flimsy temporary shelters to remind themselves of the wandering their ancestors endured, a sort of built-in annual camping trip with a lesson attached. Woven into the same section are 2 of the more startling ideas in the whole law, the Sabbath year and the Jubilee. Every 7th year, the land itself was to be given a complete rest, left unplanted and unworked on the reasoning that even soil deserves a break now and then. And every 50th year, in the Jubilee, debts were to be wiped clean, people who had sold themselves into servitude were to be set free, and land that had changed hands over the decades was to return to the families it originally belonged to. It was, in effect, a scheduled economic reset button, an ancient safeguard against a handful of people permanently cornering everything while everyone else fell hopelessly behind. Whether it was ever fully put into practice is a matter of some debate, but purely as a piece of social design, it was remarkably far ahead of its time. And with the rule book at last laid out in full, the story is finally ready to get moving again, which carries us into Numbers. The name, it has to be said, does the book absolutely no favors in the excitement department. It is called Numbers because it opens with a census, a complete head count of the entire nation, tribe by tribe, organized for the coming journey and in no small part for war. Somewhere out in that wilderness, someone essentially conducted the ancient world's least enviable spreadsheet exercise, tallying up an entire people by hand with no calculator, no clipboard, and presumably no coffee. And the book is named in honor of the paperwork. It is not, on the face of it, the most thrilling opening a book has ever managed. But do not let the accounting lull you to sleep, because Numbers is precisely where things begin going wrong in spectacular and memorable fashion. Before the real drama kicks off, the book tidies up a few organizational matters, and a couple of them are worth flagging because they quietly echo forward into the rest of the story. One of the 12 tribes, the Levites, is singled out and handed over entirely to the service of the tabernacle rather than to farming or soldiering, effectively made the caretaker tribe responsible for the sacred equipment and the daily running of worship. And then there is the curious institution of the Nazirite vow, a special and entirely voluntary commitment in which a person set themselves apart to God for a stretch of time by, among other things, avoiding grapes and wine completely and never once cutting their hair. Quietly file that last detail away because a certain famously strong and famously long-haired figure is going to come striding into the story a few books from now, and this obscure little vow is the fine print sitting behind him. The book also devotes real attention to arranging the sprawling camp into a strict, orderly formation, with the tabernacle planted dead center and the 12 tribes assigned specific positions around it, 3 to a side, along with a fixed marching order for whenever the whole camp packed up and set off again. It sounds tedious, and on the page it largely is, but the underlying picture is worth holding on to, because it is quietly the whole point. An entire nation is physically organized around the presence of God at its very heart, everything laid out in neat concentric rings with the sacred tent in the middle. It is essentially a portrait, drawn in tent pegs and marching columns, of the one idea the story keeps circling back to. With the camp counted, organized, and packed, the nation finally sets out for the land it has been promised all this time, and arrives at its very doorstep. This is the moment absolutely everything has been building toward, and it is precisely here on the threshold that the whole enterprise collapses in one of the most consequential failures of nerve in the entire story. Rather than march straight in, Moses sends 12 scouts, one drawn from each tribe, ahead to survey the land and bring back a report. They return hauling enormous clusters of fruit as proof of just how rich and generous the country is, which is the good news. The bad news arrives with the accompanying report, and 10 of the 12 scouts deliver it in a state of barely controlled panic. The land is magnificent, they concede, but it is also studded with fortified cities and populated by people so enormous, so genuinely towering, that the scouts describe feeling like insects standing next to them, mere grasshoppers in their own frightened eyes. In their telling, marching in would be nothing short of suicide. Only 2 of the 12, a pair named Joshua and Caleb, look at the same evidence and reach the opposite conclusion. They saw the identical fortified cities and the identical intimidating inhabitants, but their verdict was that the land was good, the promise was real, and the God who had already split a sea and dismantled an empire was not about to be stopped by tall people standing behind big walls. It is, in essence, a 10-2 vote between fear and faith, and fear wins in a crushing landslide. The people throw in their lot with the panicking majority, dissolve into weeping and despair, and begin openly wishing they had never left Egypt at all, even floating the cheerful idea of appointing a fresh leader to march them straight back into the slavery they had just escaped. It is an astonishing collapse of nerve given everything they have personally witnessed up to this point, and it does not go over well in the slightest. The consequence is severe, and it is the long-delayed answer to a question we left dangling a while back, namely why this particular journey ends up devouring 4 whole decades instead of the few weeks the distance actually called for. Because the generation that was rescued from Egypt has now, over and over and over again, flatly refused to trust the one who rescued them, that entire generation is told it will not set foot in the promised land at all. Instead, they will wander through the wilderness until they have simply lived out the remainder of their lives there, and it will fall to their children, along with the 2 faithful scouts, to be the ones who actually enter. 40 years of walking, in effect, so that a whole generation of doubters passes gradually from the scene, and a new one, born and raised out on the road, grows up ready to trust where their parents refused. It is a staggeringly long detour, and it quietly recasts all that wandering we touched on earlier, revealing it not as aimless drifting, but as a very slow and very deliberate changing of the guard. There is a bitter little coda to the whole affair with the scouts. Having just been told that their refusal to advance would cost them the land entirely, the people abruptly reversed course and decided to invade after all, charging ahead on their own initiative this time, without approval and without their leader alongside them. It went about as well as anyone might predict for a demoralized crowd scrambling uphill against fortified positions on pure impulse, and they were promptly driven back and beaten. The irony was thick enough to slice. Told to go in, they had refused out of fear, and told they had forfeited their chance. They insisted on going in anyway and were routed. It is a near-perfect portrait of a people who somehow managed to get the timing wrong in both directions at once, and it did precisely nothing to lift the mood for the long road still ahead. Naturally, 40 years cooped up in a desert with a perpetually frustrated leader does not exactly foster a spirit of warm cooperation, and Numbers duly serves up a whole string of rebellions. The most memorable is spearheaded by a man named Korah, who, together with a sizable band of supporters, challenges the authority of Moses and Aaron head-on, arguing in effect that the two of them have set themselves too far above everyone else and that the leadership ought to be shared out far more broadly. It is more or less the ancient equivalent of a hostile bid to unseat the entire management team, and it ends extremely badly for the challengers, with the ground itself splitting open beneath them. The broader lesson the book keeps returning to is the very real danger of relentless grumbling against a leadership that is, however imperfectly and however wearily, actually carrying out the assignment it was handed. The grumbling took other forms too, and a couple of the resulting episodes are worth pausing on. At one point, the people grew so thoroughly sick of the daily manna that they wailed for meat, loudly reminiscing about the fish and vegetables of Egypt as though slavery had somehow come with a decent lunch menu. And in response, an enormous flock of quail was sent down, more than enough to teach the whole crowd to be careful what it demanded. On another occasion, when a wave of venomous snakes swept through the camp, Moses was instructed to fashion a serpent out of bronze and mount it high on a pole so that anyone who had been bitten needed only to look up at it to be healed. It is a curious and memorable image, a likeness of the very thing causing the harm lifted up as the remedy for it. And it is one more of those quiet threads the wider story deliberately tucks away to unspool a great deal further on. Even Moses himself does not emerge from these years unscathed. At one point, with the people once again wailing about a lack of drinking water, he is instructed to simply speak to a rock so that water will pour out of it. But Moses, worn paper-thin by decades of nonstop complaints from a crowd that has never met a hardship it would not moan about, instead loses his temper completely, snaps at the assembled people, and strikes the rock with his staff rather than speaking to it as he had been told. The water gushes out regardless, but the flash of disobedience costs him dearly, and he is quietly informed that he, too, will not be the one to lead the people across into the land. It is a genuinely heartbreaking turn for the man who has shepherded this famously ungrateful crowd across an entire wilderness for the better part of a lifetime, and it plants the seed of the sorrowful note that the following book will eventually close on. And then, right in the thick of all this weightiness, Numbers hands us one of the single strangest and frankly most entertaining episodes in the whole Bible. As the wandering nation approaches the territory of Moab, the local king, a man named Balak, becomes thoroughly spooked by the sheer size of the crowd massing on his border, and decides to deal with the threat not through battle but through cursing. He hires a well-known freelance prophet named Balaam to come and lay a curse on the people, evidently operating on the logic that a professional-grade curse was a perfectly sound military investment. Balaam saddles up his donkey and sets off to earn his fee. What happens on the road is where the whole thing becomes wonderful. An angel with a drawn sword plants itself directly in the path to block Balaam, and here is the delicious twist. Balaam, the celebrated professional seer, the man hired specifically for his supernatural insight, cannot see it at all. His donkey, however, can see it perfectly well. The animal, showing rather more sense than its rider, flatly refuses to walk straight into an armed angel and keeps veering off the road to avoid it, at one point crushing Balaam's foot against a wall in its desperate efforts to sidestep certain death. Balaam, oblivious to the celestial roadblock and assuming his mount has simply turned mulish, beats the poor creature 3 separate times. At which point the donkey does the only reasonable thing left available to it, which is to open its mouth and ask in plain human speech what exactly it has done to earn this treatment. And Balaam, in a detail that tells you everything you need to know about his professional judgment, simply argues back, apparently entirely unruffled by the fact that his donkey has just started holding up its end of a conversation. Only afterward are his eyes finally opened to see the angel his donkey had been dodging the whole time. The gentle joke woven through the entire affair is impossible to overlook. The humble beast of burden had far sharper spiritual vision than the famous prophet perched on its back. The punchline of the larger episode lands just as neatly. When Balaam at last arrives to perform the job he was handsomely paid for and opens his mouth to curse the nation, what comes tumbling out instead is a blessing. King Balak, understandably beside himself, hauls him off to a completely different vantage point to try the whole thing again, and Balaam promptly blesses them a second time. And then a third. Every single attempt to summon a curse comes out as praise, no matter how many times the increasingly exasperated king relocates his hired prophet for a fresh angle on the target, until Balak more or less throws up his hands and gives up any hope of getting his money's worth. The message tucked beneath all the comedy is a serious one, that no purchased curse can override the promise hanging protectively over these people. But the story chooses to deliver that message by way of a talking donkey and a thoroughly flustered king, which is a fine reminder that this ancient library has a real sense of humor of its own whenever it decides to use it. Toward the end of the book, with the doubting generation nearly gone, a second census is taken, this time counting the new generation that has grown up out in the desert and will actually be the ones to cross over, a neat bookend to the head count the book opened with. And tucked into this same stretch is a small but genuinely notable episode involving 5 sisters, the daughters of a man named Zelophehad, whose father had died leaving no sons. Under the customs of the day, that would ordinarily have meant the family's inheritance simply evaporated, since property passed down through male heirs alone. The sisters came forward and argued quite reasonably that this arrangement was unfair to them, and the ruling came back in their favor, formally establishing that daughters could inherit in the absence of any sons. It is the kind of thing that is easy to skim straight past, but for its time it was a strikingly forward-looking piece of case law, and a small reminder that the rule book was not always quite as rigid as its dusty reputation would suggest. By the time Numbers finally winds down, the long detour is very nearly complete. The older doubting generation has largely passed from the scene, and the first of the tribes begin settling on the near side of the border, staking out patches of territory right on the fringe of the Promised Land. The nation is at last genuinely within reach of the goal. Everything is set for the crossing, which is, of course, precisely the moment the 5th and final book of this opening section steps in to slow the whole thing down one last time, for a reason that turns out to be deeply moving rather than merely procedural. That final book is Deuteronomy, and it is essentially one very long goodbye. The name itself rather gives the game away, since it means, roughly, second law, a fitting label for a book that consists in large part of the law being carefully gone over one more time for a brand new audience. The entire book unfolds in a single location, the plains of Moab, right on the edge of the land, and it consists almost wholly of Moses speaking. This is, remember, the very man who once protested at the burning bush that he was hopeless with words and needed his brother brought along to do the talking for him. Several decades and one liberated nation later, that same reluctant, tongue-tied speaker suddenly cannot seem to stop, delivering a whole series of lengthy farewell addresses to the people he has led across the full span of their journey. Life, it seems, has a certain quiet sense of humor about who it eventually turns into a talker. The reason behind all this speaking is both practical and rather poignant. The crowd standing in front of Moses is, for the most part, no longer the crowd that walked out of Egypt. It is their children, the desert-born generation that came of age on the road and never personally laid eyes on the Great Escape or the mountain wrapped in smoke and fire. So Moses undertakes the necessary work of retelling the whole saga to them from the beginning, walking them carefully back through the journey and the law, reminding them how their parents rebelled again and again, and how, in spite of every single failure, the God who made the promises never once walked away. It is part history lesson, part legal review, and part impassioned plea from an old man who wants nothing more than for this fresh generation to sidestep the mistakes that doomed the one before it. At the very core of all this speaking sits a single line that has served as the beating heartbeat of Jewish faith ever since. A declaration most often remembered by its opening words, "Hear, O Israel," affirming that God is one and calling the people to love that God with the whole of their heart and strength. It is short, it is central, and it has been recited daily by countless people across thousands of years right down to the present. If Deuteronomy rests on a single foundation stone, that declaration is unquestionably it, and nearly everything else Moses says over the course of the book is, in one form or another, an unfolding of that one sentence. Attached to that central declaration is a very practical instruction about what to actually do with it, and it is oddly touching. The people are told to keep these words constantly before them and to teach them diligently to their children. talking them over at home and out on the road, when they lie down at night and when they rise in the morning. They are even told to bind the words onto their hands and foreheads and to write them on the doorframes of their houses. Those last instructions were eventually taken quite literally, and they are the direct origin of the small boxes of scripture some people still wear during prayer and the little cases still fixed to doorposts in many homes to this day. It is a rare case of an ancient command you can still watch being carried out, unchanged, thousands of years down the line. Arranged around that center, Moses lays out the great choice facing the nation in the starkest possible terms. He sets two roads before them. Down the first lies faithfulness to the covenant, and traveling with it a long, generous catalog of blessings, prosperity, security, and genuine flourishing in the land they are about to enter. Down the second lies abandonment of that same covenant, and traveling with it an even longer and considerably more alarming catalog of curses, an entire chapter crammed with them, spelling out in unflinching detail the disasters that will follow if the people ever turn away, running the full grim range from defeat and disease to being torn up by the roots and scattered out of the very land they are on the brink of receiving. It is a genuinely sobering piece of writing, and it is not there for decoration. Those blessings and curses are effectively the terms and conditions of the entire national relationship. And without giving too much of the plot away, the history books still to come are going to read like a long, painful demonstration of that catalog quietly coming true point by point. Moses is, in effect, handing the people a warning label that they will go on to spend centuries conspicuously failing to read. He is also careful to puncture any budding sense of superiority before it can so much as take root. It would be the easiest thing in the world, he tells them, to march into that land, overcome its towering inhabitants, and stroll away convinced that they triumphed because they so richly deserved to. Not so, Moses insists, and firmly. They are not being handed this territory as a gold star for their own righteousness, a quality this particular crowd has displayed in famously short supply. They are receiving it instead because the current occupants have grown so thoroughly corrupt over the centuries that their time has simply run out, and because of the promise made to a wandering ancestor a very long time ago. It is a pointed little exercise in humility enforcement, delivered by a man who has personally watched these people bow down to a golden statue and openly plot a return to slavery, and who therefore harbors precisely zero illusions about their moral splendor. One theme Moses circles back to again and again in these speeches is the peculiar danger not of hardship but of comfort. He warns the people, with striking foresight, that the real threat waiting for them is not the wilderness they are finally leaving behind but the good life they are about to inherit. When the houses stand full, the harvests come in abundant, and daily life has grown soft and easy, he cautions, that is exactly the moment they will be tempted to forget where any of it came from and quietly assume they built the whole thing themselves. It is a remarkably shrewd read on human nature that people tend to cry out desperately for help in a crisis, and then forget all about it the instant things start going well. And it hangs over everything that follows like a quiet prophecy of precisely how the good times are going to be squandered. Deuteronomy is not all grand choices and dire warnings, though. Threaded through it is a surprisingly practical body of law for running an actual society, and a couple of pieces stand out for how far ahead they manage to look. The book quietly anticipates that the people will one day want a king, and rather than forbidding the idea outright, it lays down rules for that future monarch in advance, warning him against hoarding wealth, piling up horses and armies, or ever coming to think himself grander than his fellow citizens. Advice which, without spoiling too much, a fair number of later kings will go on to ignore with real enthusiasm. It also establishes cities of refuge, designated places where a person who had killed someone by accident could flee and receive a fair hearing rather than being cut down on the spot by a grieving relative. An early and genuinely thoughtful attempt to draw a firm line between deliberate murder and a tragic accident. For a legal code this ancient, that is a strikingly humane distinction to have bothered making at all. To seal the entire arrangement, Moses stages what amounts to a formal renewal of the covenant, going so far as to call on heaven and earth themselves to stand as witnesses to the agreement, a dramatic flourish that drives home just how binding the whole thing is meant to be. This is not a loose bundle of friendly suggestions, but a solemn witness contract between a people and their God, freely entered into right on the edge of a new life. And with the terms spelled out, the witnesses summoned, and the choice laid as plainly as it can possibly be laid, there is very little left to do but hand everything over to the next leader and step quietly aside. Running quietly beneath every word of Deuteronomy, though, is a deep and unmistakable personal sadness, because Moses knows exactly how his own story ends, and it does not end inside the promised land. Barred from crossing over on account of that earlier moment of anger at the rock, he is about to hand off the very destination he has spent 40 years steadily walking toward, fully aware that he himself will never once set foot across its border. Before he goes, he does the responsible thing and formally installs his successor, Joshua, one of the 2 scouts who, all those long years ago, believed the land could actually be taken. It is a deeply fitting choice, leadership passing to one of the small handful of people who trusted the promise back when nearly everyone around them was busy panicking. Moses commissions him publicly, encourages him, steadies him for the enormous task ahead, and effectively passes on the torch he can no longer carry himself. For all that it reads like an old man's drawn-out farewell, Deuteronomy went on to become one of the most quietly influential books in the entire collection. Later generations, later reformers, later prophets would reach back to it constantly, treating it as the benchmark against which the whole nation measured whether it had stayed faithful or wandered off course. Whenever kings much further down the road wanted to call the people back to their roots, this is the book they reached for. So while the man delivering these speeches was standing very much at the end of his own story, the words themselves were only at the very beginning of theirs. Near the very end, before he climbs his final mountain, Moses does 2 last things. He teaches the people a long song, a poetic piece meant to be memorized and passed down through the generations, so that even in seasons when the written law was neglected, the words themselves would linger on in memory, sung around fires and taught to children, a warning set quietly to melody. And then, in the manner of an aging patriarch gathering his family one last time, he pronounces a blessing over each of the 12 tribes in turn, a personal farewell to every branch of the nation he has carried this far. Only after all of that does he set his affairs fully in order and turn at last to face the end. And then comes the ending, which is one of the quietest and most affecting in the whole of this opening act. Moses climbs a mountain called Nebo, entirely alone, and from its summit God shows him the promised land spread out in the distance, the entire country he has led a whole nation toward but will never himself walk across. He sees it with his own eyes, this destination of an entire lifetime, laid out clearly just beyond his reach. And there, on that mountaintop, at the remarkable age of 120, Moses dies, within sight of the goal but forever outside it. It is a strikingly restrained and deeply human way to close the book on the towering central figure of the whole first act, less a triumphant victory lap than one long, wistful, farewell look at something almost but not entirely reached. With that, the Pentateuch, those 5 foundational books that hold up everything to come, draws to a close. And it is worth noticing exactly where it chooses to leave everyone. The great leader is gone. A brand new generation stands massed at the very edge of the land. A fresh commander now at its head, all of them staring across the water at a country bristling with fortified cities, and populated by the very peoples the frightened scouts once described in such alarming terms. The promise made all the way back to a single childless old man is now closer to fulfillment than it has ever been, hovering tantalizingly just across the river, and yet not one solitary foot has actually crossed it. The book simply stops there, balanced on that taut and expectant edge, an entire nation coiled and ready to invade, while the outcome hangs completely and deliberately open. It is at one and the same time the final curtain on the first act and the winding up of a spring, all that accumulated tension held in place and waiting to be let loose into the conquest that comes next. The spring, at long last, is released. With Moses gone and a new commander now at the head of the column, the nation that spent 40 years circling the wilderness finally wades across the river and steps onto the soil it was promised all those centuries earlier. What follows unfolds across 3 books, and taken together they tell a slightly deflating story. The people seize the land with startling speed and then, almost immediately, begin loosening their grip on the very thing that made them who they were. It is a pattern we have watched play out in miniature before. But here it finally unfolds on a full national scale. The first of the three is Joshua, named for the commander himself, that rare scout who once believed the land could be taken back when everyone around him was busy panicking. Now he finally gets to prove it. Before a single wall fell, though, the nation faced an immediate obstacle, a river running high directly between them and the land. And here the story stages a deliberate echo of an earlier miracle, because as the priests carrying the ark stepped into the water, the river stopped flowing and the whole people crossed over on dry ground, exactly the way their parents had crossed the sea a generation before. It was a pointed signal that the same power which had once stood behind Moses now stood behind Joshua, in case anyone was tempted to doubt the new leadership. To mark the spot, they hauled 12 stones up out of the riverbed and stacked them into a memorial, the ancient equivalent of planting a flag, so that future generations would ask what it meant and be told the whole story. And the campaign opens with a scene so famous that even people who have never once cracked the book have somehow heard of it. The fall of Jericho, a heavily fortified city sitting squarely in the nation's path. The strategy for taking it, handed down from above, was not one you will find in any military manual, then or since. There was no battering ram, no siege engine, no clever tunnel dug under the foundations. Instead, the army was instructed simply to march around the city once a day for 6 days in complete silence, and then on the 7th day to circle it 7 times, let out a great shout, and blow their horns. That was the entire plan, start to finish, and defying every expectation of how siege warfare is supposed to work, the walls came down. It was, without any real competition, the most unorthodox demolition job in ancient history, and it succeeded precisely because the point was never really about the engineering. Before those walls fell, though, there is a smaller story worth telling because it turns out to matter far more than its modest size suggests. Joshua had earlier slipped a pair of scouts into Jericho to size the place up, and they found shelter in the home of a local woman named Rahab, who ran an establishment of, let us gently say, questionable reputation built right into the city wall. When the king's men came hunting for the spies, Rahab hid them under some stalks of flax on her roof and sent the search party off chasing shadows in the wrong direction, then quietly struck a deal. In exchange for protecting the 2 scouts, she and her whole family would be spared when the city inevitably fell. She was, on paper, exactly the sort of person you would least expect to end up on the right side of this story, a foreigner in a doomed city with a thoroughly disreputable line of work. And yet not only is she spared, she is later stitched directly into the ancestry of the nation's greatest king. The story has a real habit of doing this, reaching straight past the respectable and the expected to pluck out the outsider nobody would have chosen, and it is worth noticing every single time it happens. Not everything went smoothly, however, and the very next episode is essentially a cautionary tale about one person quietly ruining things for absolutely everyone. Fresh off the triumph at Jericho, the army marched confidently against a much smaller town and humiliatingly lost. The reason, it soon emerged, was a man named Achan, who had secretly helped himself to some of the plunder that had been strictly declared off limits and then buried it under his tent, presumably hoping nobody would go looking. One person's private greed in the unforgiving logic of the book had compromised the entire enterprise, rather like a single member of a team quietly breaking a rule and the whole group taking the punishment for it. Once the hidden loot was uncovered and the matter dealt with, the campaign resumed, and this time it rolled forward with genuinely remarkable momentum. Not every victory came by the sword, and one of the stranger episodes involved a group of neighbors who survived through sheer creativity. A people called the Gibeonites, terrified after hearing what had happened to Jericho, worked out that they could never win a straight fight, so they tried deception instead. They sent envoys dressed in worn-out clothes and carrying moldy, crumbling bread, pretending to be travelers from a faraway land in order to trick Joshua into swearing a peace treaty with them. It worked, largely because nobody thought to double-check the story before taking the oath, and by the time the ruse came to light, the treaty was binding and the Gibeonites were spared permanently on the strength of some stale bread and a bit of good acting. It was a fine reminder that not every problem in the conquest got solved by marching. Shortly afterward, while defending these very allies, Joshua fought a battle during which, the book reports, the sun itself paused in the sky to give the army enough daylight to finish the job, which is about as dramatic an extension of working hours as history has ever recorded. That momentum carried the nation through a sweeping military campaign across the whole territory, and the book keeps a running tally that reads almost like a stock-taking inventory. By the time the fighting finally winds down, something in the region of 31 local kings have been defeated, their territories swallowed up, and the conquered land is carefully parceled out among the 12 tribes, each one receiving its own allotted portion to settle and farm. Joshua, having steered the whole thing, gathers the people together at the end of his life and challenges them to stay faithful, to choose clearly and deliberately whom they intend to serve rather than simply drifting along. They enthusiastically agree, naturally. Whether they will actually follow through on any of it is, as ever, an entirely separate question, and the very next book exists more or less to answer it. For all its victories, the conquest was never actually finished. Pockets of the original inhabitants remained scattered throughout the land, and rather than continuing to press them out, the tribes increasingly settled in alongside them, intermarried, and gradually absorbed their customs and their gods. This half-completed job is the fuse for nearly everything that goes wrong next, because the very neighbors the people failed to deal with become the source of the temptations and the oppressions that will define the following book. Joshua ended on a high note of loyalty and firm resolve, but the resolve, as tends to happen, did not survive contact with the next generation. That next book is Judges, and it is essentially the long, drawn-out sound of all those enthusiastic promises quietly falling to pieces. With Joshua and his whole generation gone, there is no longer a single figure holding the nation together, and the 12 tribes are left as a loose, squabbling collection with no central leadership to speak of. What follows is one of the most repetitive stretches of the entire story, and it is repetitive entirely on purpose, because the repetition is the whole point. The book settles into a grim and utterly predictable cycle that spins around again and again. The people drift away and fall into worshiping the local idols of their neighbors. As a direct consequence, they wind up oppressed or outright enslaved by some surrounding nation. Eventually, thoroughly miserable, they cry out for rescue. God raises up a deliverer, a champion known as a judge, who throws off the oppressor and buys the land a stretch of peace. And then, the very moment things grow comfortable again, the people promptly forget the entire lesson and drift right back into the same trouble, restarting the whole cycle from the top. It is the national equivalent of repeatedly slapping the snooze button, learning nothing whatsoever, and being genuinely baffled each morning to find yourself late. The word judge here, it should be said, is a little misleading to modern ears. These were not dignified people in robes settling property disputes and banging gavels. They were far closer to local military leaders and rally the troops champions, raised up in the middle of a crisis to unite the people and drive out whoever happened to be oppressing them at the time. And the gallery of them the book parades past is, without exaggeration, one of the more colorful casts assembled anywhere in the collection. There is Ehud, for a start, remembered chiefly for being left-handed, which sounds like a throwaway detail right up until you realize it was the entire foundation of his plan. Sent to deliver tribute to an enormously overweight oppressor king, Ehud concealed a blade on the one side no right-handed guard would ever think to pat down, secured himself a private audience, and dealt with the king before anyone was any the wiser, then slipped out and rallied the people to a decisive victory. It was, in short, an assassination that worked largely because everybody underestimated a left-handed man, which is an oddly specific lesson to carry away from history, but there it is. Then there is Deborah, one of the few figures across this whole stretch who commands genuine respect from beginning to end. A prophetess and leader at a time when neither role was remotely ordinary for a woman, she directed a campaign against a powerful enemy commander, and correctly foresaw that the decisive blow would come not from some celebrated warrior, but from a woman, and so it did. The fleeing enemy general took shelter in the tent of a woman named Jael, who welcomed him in with every show of hospitality, waited patiently for him to fall asleep, and then, with considerable nerve and a well-placed tent peg, made certain he never woke up again. It was not remotely the heroic battlefield death the general had presumably pictured for himself, and the book records the whole thing with a distinct note of dry satisfaction. Gideon is another standout, and his story features one of the most gloriously counterintuitive command decisions in all of military history. Facing a vast enemy horde with an army of some 32,000 men, Gideon was informed that his force was, of all possible complaints, far too large, on the reasoning that an easy victory would only let the people credit their own strength rather than God. So the army was trimmed down, and then trimmed again, and then trimmed once more using a strangely specific test involving how the remaining men drank water from a stream, until Gideon was left holding a grand total of 300 soldiers to throw against an army that outnumbered him beyond counting. It is very possibly the only recorded instance of a general being ordered to aggressively downsize his own military immediately before a major battle, and against every reasonable expectation, the tiny band won, mostly by making a tremendous racket in the dark and letting the panicked enemy turn its swords on itself. Not every judge was a triumph, and as the book goes on, the deliverers grow steadily more compromised, almost as though the whole nation were slowly winding down. One of the later figures, a man named Jephthah, won his battle but made a reckless, ill-considered vow beforehand, promising to sacrifice whatever came out of his door to greet him if he returned victorious, apparently without pausing to think about who was most likely to run out to meet him first. It ended in tragedy for his own daughter, and it stands as a grim illustration of the danger of bargaining rashly and treating devotion as though it were a transaction. The judges, in other words, were never meant to be flawless heroes. They were flickering, temporary fixes in a story that was quietly building the case that the people needed something far more lasting than a rotating cast of local champions. And then, of course, there is Samson, the strong man whose story we have quietly been holding a seat for, ever since that peculiar little vow first surfaced 2 books back. Samson was dedicated from birth under exactly that kind of arrangement, the one whose fine print forbade ever cutting his hair, and his legendary borderline superhuman strength was bound up entirely with keeping that vow intact. Unfortunately, Samson had the self-control of an overtired toddler and the impulse management to match, and his story is basically a long string of astonishing feats repeatedly undercut by even more astonishing lapses in judgment. He tore a lion apart with his bare hands. On one memorable occasion, nursing a grudge, he rounded up 300 foxes, fastened torches to them, and sent them stampeding through his enemy's grain fields, which is not a strategy that would spring to most people's minds, and frankly, probably should not have sprung to his. He once took down a small army armed with nothing but the jawbone of a donkey he happened to find lying nearby, which is the sort of weapon you resort to only after running out of every other option in existence. Samson's downfall, entirely predictably, arrived through his complete and total inability to keep his own secret. He became entangled with a woman named Delilah, who was quietly on the payroll of his enemies and kept relentlessly pestering him to reveal the source of his remarkable strength. After toying with her through a run of obviously false answers, he inexplicably went ahead and told her the actual truth, that it was all tied to his uncut hair. She promptly arranged to have his head shaved while he slept, his strength drained clean away, and his enemies seized him with ease. It is a downfall so thoroughly self-inflicted that it is almost painful to watch unfold. But the story is not quite finished, because his hair naturally begins to grow slowly back. Dragged out to be mocked at a great gathering inside an enemy temple, Samson quietly positioned himself between the 2 central support pillars and in one final act brought the entire structure crashing down. It was a dramatic and comprehensively total ending, and about as subtle as absolutely everything else the man had ever done. Hovering over this whole parade of dysfunction is a single line the book keeps circling back to, a kind of weary, resigned refrain. In those days there was no king, and everyone simply did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. It functions as both an explanation and a diagnosis at once. Without any unifying leadership or shared standard to hold to, the nation had fragmented into everyone freelancing their own private morality, with results that were, predictably, chaotic. And that quiet, repeated observation is doing something rather clever underneath the surface, because it is patiently planting a question in the reader's mind. If the absence of a king is the problem, then perhaps a king is the answer. The book is, in effect, setting up the very demand that will drive the next major stretch of the whole story. By its closing chapters, the book has descended into genuine anarchy, with the tribes very nearly turning on one another in open civil war and society fraying at every visible seam. It is a bleak and unsettling way to end, and it drives the central point home with brutal clarity. Left entirely to their own devices, with no leadership and no shared moral center to hold to, people do not gradually drift toward order. They drift toward chaos. The book leaves us staring squarely at that uncomfortable conclusion, with the unspoken question of whether a king might fix any of it hanging heavier in the air than ever. But before we arrive at kings, the story does something genuinely unexpected and rather lovely. Dropped straight into the middle of all this national chaos is a small, quiet book named Ruth, and it functions almost like a palate cleanser after the relentless turmoil of everything around it. It is a domestic story, intimate and gentle, about ordinary people living through those same turbulent times, and it stands as one of the very few genuinely tender narratives in this entire section of the collection. Ruth herself is a foreigner, a woman from Moab, which, as we have already seen more than once, was not exactly a warm and neighborly nation. Widowed young, she makes the extraordinary choice to leave her own homeland entirely and stay loyal to her grieving mother-in-law, following her back to an unfamiliar country where she holds no status and enjoys no security whatsoever, declaring that she will make her mother-in-law's people her people and her God her God. In that new land, with no means of support at all, she survives by gleaning, gathering up the leftover grain that harvesters were required by law to leave behind for the poor and the foreigner. One of those quietly humane provisions built into the rule book we met earlier. It is while gleaning in his fields that she catches the attention of a decent and honorable man named Boaz. Boaz turns out to be what the custom of the time called a kinsman redeemer, a relative with both the right and the willingness to step in, buy back the family's lost land, and marry the widow in order to keep the family line from dying out. He does exactly that, folding Ruth, an outsider by every conceivable measure, fully into the community. And that idea of a redeemer stepping in to rescue and restore what was lost is yet another of those quiet threads worth tucking away. It is a warm and hopeful little tale entirely on its own terms, but it quietly carries a significance that stretches far beyond its size, because Ruth, this foreign widow from a hostile nation, goes on to become the great-grandmother of the very king the whole story has been steadily building toward. Once again, the ancestry of the future runs straight through an outsider nobody sensible would have picked, and with her, the family line of the coming king is being carefully assembled, one improbable link at a time, which carries us, at very long last, to kings. The books of Samuel open with the nation still mired in the tail end of that leaderless chaos, and the people finally arrive at a firm decision. They want a king. Not another temporary crisis champion who turns up, wins a battle, and then fades quietly back into the crowd, but a permanent monarch, a proper royal figure exactly like the ones all the surrounding nations already have. It is, at its very heart, a straightforward case of keeping up with the neighbors, the ancient version of wanting something chiefly because everyone else on the block already owns one. There is a deeper wrinkle to the request, though, and it is worth pausing on. Up to this point, the nation's true king had always, at least in theory, been God himself, with the human leaders acting only as temporary stand-ins. So the demand for a permanent human monarch was, underneath the surface, a quiet rejection of that whole arrangement, a preference for a visible ruler they could see and point to over an invisible one they simply had to trust. It was less a neutral administrative upgrade than a subtle vote of no confidence, and it was received as exactly that. The request would be granted in the end, but it came with something of a sigh. The figure they bring this demand to is Samuel, the last of the judges and a genuine prophet, a man who had been dedicated to service since he was a small child. His own beginning was a story in itself. He had been born to a woman named Hannah who had long been unable to have children and who prayed for a son with such raw, silent desperation that a watching priest at first mistook her trembling lips for drunkenness. When the boy finally arrived, she kept her promise and gave him over to the service of the sanctuary, and it was there, still a child, that Samuel first heard God calling him by name in the night, repeatedly mistaking the voice for the old priest down the hall until someone finally realized what was actually going on. He grew into the most respected figure of his entire generation. Samuel is deeply uneasy about the entire idea, and he responds with a blunt, unvarnished warning about precisely what having a king is going to cost them down the line. A king, he cautions, will conscript their sons for his armies and his building projects, take their daughters into his service, help himself to the best of their fields and vineyards and harvests, and taxed them heavily for the sheer privilege of being ruled over. It is essentially a complete, honest disclosure of the fine print, delivered plainly and well in advance. The people, in the grand and timeless tradition of everyone who has ever scrolled straight past the terms and conditions to hammer the accept button, listen to every word of it and demand a king anyway. One memorable episode from around this same era is worth a short detour because it turns the ark into something like a hot potato that nobody could safely hold. In a battle that went badly, the ark was actually captured by the Philistines, the nation's most persistent enemies, who carried it off as a trophy and proudly set it up in the temple of their own god like a prize on a shelf. This did not go at all well for them. Their idol kept mysteriously toppling over in front of it, and a wave of affliction swept through every city the ark was moved to, until the Philistines, thoroughly spooked, could not get rid of the thing fast enough and shipped it right back with gifts attached, essentially the ancient equivalent of returning a cursed item to the store along with a heartfelt apology note. It was a pointed demonstration that the ark was never a good luck charm to be captured and controlled, but something to be handled with genuine care. So Samuel goes ahead and anoints one. The first king is a man named Saul, and on paper he could hardly look more the part. He is tall, striking, and stands head and shoulders above everyone around him, exactly the sort of physically impressive figure a people desperate to match their neighbors would have hoped for. Unfortunately, looking like a king and actually being one turn out to be two very different propositions. Saul starts off reasonably enough but unravels with alarming speed, disobeying clear instructions more than once. On one occasion, losing his nerve before a battle and overstepping into a role that was not his to take rather than waiting as he had been told, growing insecure and suspicious of everyone around him, and sliding steadily down into a jealous, brooding, corrosive paranoia. He is a cautionary study in how the outward packaging can be flawless, while the inside slowly comes apart at the seams, and before very long it becomes painfully clear that he is not, in fact, the leader the nation actually needs. And so, quietly and entirely in secret, Samuel is sent off to anoint a replacement while Saul is still very much sitting on the throne, which naturally makes for an extremely awkward overlap. The new choice could hardly be further from the tall, imposing Saul if the story had designed him that way on purpose, which it more or less did. He is the youngest son of an ordinary family, a shepherd boy named David, so thoroughly overlooked that he was out minding the sheep and very nearly not even called in from the field when the prophet came to visit. The lesson, made almost comically explicit, is that the story cares far more about what a person is on the inside than about whether they happen to look impressive from clear across the room. David steps properly into the wider story through the single most famous underdog moment in the entire collection. A massive enemy warrior named Goliath, a giant of a man clad head to toe in armor, had been taunting the nation's army daily, loudly challenging anyone at all to face him in single combat, and the seasoned professional soldiers were understandably in no great hurry to raise their hands. David, at that point still just a youth who had come to check on his older brothers, was appalled that not a single person would answer the challenge and volunteered to go himself. Turning down the offer of heavy royal armor, which did not fit him in the slightest anyway, he strode out to meet the towering, heavily armed champion carrying nothing more than a simple sling and a handful of smooth stones plucked from a stream bed. It was, by every conventional measure imaginable, a hopeless mismatch, and with a single well-aimed stone the giant came crashing down. It is the original underdog story, the small and dismissed toppling the enormous and overconfident, and it launched David into instant, kingdom-wide fame overnight. There's a quiet irony in how David first entered the king's household, because before he was ever a rival, he was a comfort. Saul, tormented by his own dark moods, had David brought in to play the harp and soothe him, which means the very man Saul would later spend years hunting had originally been hired precisely to calm him down. And as David rose in fame, he found an unlikely and deeply loyal friend in Jonathan, Saul's own son. By every rule of royal ambition, Jonathan should have seen David as the ultimate threat, the outsider poised to seize the crown that was his to inherit. Instead, the two formed one of the most celebrated friendships in the entire collection, with Jonathan repeatedly shielding David from his father's fury, even at real cost to himself. It is a striking portrait of loyalty placed above self-interest, which is not a combination the royal families in this story are otherwise famous for. That fame, unfortunately, turned out to be exactly the problem. As David's popularity climbed higher and higher, with people openly singing his praises above even the king's, Saul curdled with envy and turned on him completely. What followed was years of David living as a hunted fugitive, relentlessly pursued by the increasingly unstable king across the wilderness and the caves. And here the story goes out of its way to make a point about David's character that matters enormously later on. On more than one occasion, David had Saul entirely at his mercy, close enough and unguarded enough to end the whole exhausting pursuit permanently with a single stroke. And each time he flatly refused to harm him, unwilling to raise his hand against a man who had once been anointed as king. It would have been the easy, obvious, tidy solution to every single one of his troubles, and he passed it up on sheer principle, which tells you a great deal about why the story holds him in the regard it does. His years on the run were not all narrow escapes and noble restraint, however, and on at least one occasion his temper nearly got the better of him. Insulted by a wealthy, boorish landowner who flatly refused to show his men even basic courtesy, David set out fully intending to wipe out the man and his entire household in a fit of wounded pride. What stopped him was the man's wife, a sharp and level-headed woman named Abigail, who rode out to intercept David with provisions and a carefully reasoned plea, talking him down from an act he would certainly have regretted for the rest of his life. David thanked her sincerely for saving him from himself, and when her foolish husband conveniently died soon afterward of natural causes, David married her. It is a small episode, but it quietly reveals that his celebrated self-control sometimes needed a firm outside nudge to hold. Saul's own story, meanwhile, spirals toward a genuinely tragic close. Abandoned by the guidance he had once leaned on and terrified on the eve of a major battle, the king who had earlier banned mediums crept out in disguise to consult one himself, a woman at a place called Endor, in a desperate, forbidden attempt to learn his fate. The message he received was grim, and it proved entirely accurate. The very next day his army was routed, and Saul fell in the fighting, his reign ending in the same fear and desperation that had consumed most of it. And with that, David's long, patient wait finally comes to its end. He is made king, and he proceeds to do the one thing not a single judge before him ever managed. He unites the fractured, squabbling tribes into a single kingdom under one crown. He captures a well-positioned stronghold and establishes it as his capital, a city called Jerusalem that will loom over the rest of the entire story from this point onward. And in a moment that ties neatly back to something set up a very long way back, he brings the ark, that same gold-covered chest from the wilderness tabernacle, up into his brand-new capital, dancing before it along the way with such undignified, unrestrained enthusiasm that it reportedly mortified members of his own household. For a while, this is the golden age in full bloom. The kingdom is united, secure, and flourishing, and David sits comfortably at the very height of his power and his reputation. With the ark now resting in his capital, David conceived a natural ambition: to build a permanent, magnificent house for it, a proper temple to replace the portable tent that had served the nation since the wilderness. It was a generous impulse, but the answer that came back was, in effect, not you and not yet. David had been too much a man of war, with too much blood spilled across a lifetime of fighting, and the honor of building that house would instead fall to his son, who would one day reign in an era of peace. David accepted this without complaint, and busied himself gathering materials and drawing up plans for a project he knew he would never see completed himself, which is its own quiet kind of faithfulness, laying the groundwork for a future you already understand you will not personally get to enjoy, which, in this particular story, is very nearly always the precise moment everything goes wrong. At the peak of his success, comfortable and idle back home, while his armies were off fighting a war without him, David caught sight of a woman named Bathsheba, the wife of one of his own loyal soldiers, and decided that being king meant he could simply take whatever he happened to want. He did. She became pregnant, and David, rather than owning the situation and facing it, launched into an increasingly desperate and clumsy cover-up. When his various attempts to disguise the affair all failed, he arranged for the woman's husband to be posted to the very front line of the fiercest fighting, and then quietly abandoned there to die, effectively engineering a loyal man's death to bury his own wrongdoing. It is a genuinely dark chapter, and pointedly, deliberately so, because the story flatly refuses to pretend its great hero is spotless. The greatest king the nation ever produced was also fully capable of the coldest imaginable betrayal. He does not, however, get away with it. A prophet named Nathan comes to confront him, and does so with real cunning rather than raw nerve. Instead of accusing the king to his face, which was historically a reliable way to have yourself permanently removed from the guest list, Nathan tells him a story about a wealthy man with vast flocks and herds who cruelly stole and slaughtered the single beloved lamb belonging to a poor neighbor. David, not spotting the trap for a second, erupts in genuine outrage and declares that a man capable of such a thing deserves the harshest punishment, at which point Nathan delivers the quiet, devastating reveal that the man in the story is David himself. It is a masterclass in maneuvering someone into condemning their own behavior out loud before they have any idea they are the subject of the tale, and it lands with the force of a dropped hammer. David is genuinely broken by it and repents on the spot, but the consequences are already set grinding into motion regardless, and they play out, as these things so often do, within the walls of his own family. And those consequences are heavy. David's later years are darkened by turmoil among his own children, building toward one of his sons, a young man named Absalom, mounting a full-blown armed rebellion to tear the throne away from his father, forcing the aging king to flee for his life from his own beloved capital. The revolt eventually collapses, and Absalom is killed, in a detail almost too fitting to have been invented, caught and left dangling helplessly when his famously long, luxurious hair snagged fast in the low branches of a tree as he rode beneath it. David's raw grief at the death of his rebellious son is one of the most genuinely human moments in the entire account. The broken cry of a father who has lost a child he could neither control nor stop loving for even a moment. Whatever else he may have been, David was never once a cardboard hero, and the story is immeasurably more powerful for refusing to make him one. It is worth noting, too, that David poured all of this raw feeling straight into words. He was a gifted poet and musician, and many of the songs and laments attributed to him capture the full emotional range of a turbulent life, from soaring praise to bitter grief to desperate cries for help. When his rival Saul and his beloved friend Jonathan both fell in that final battle, David composed a moving elegy for the two of them, openly mourning even the man who had hunted him relentlessly for years. This side of him, the shepherd who sang, will matter a great deal when we reach the great collection of poetry later on, much of which traces back to this very same complicated king. He fought like a warrior, but he grieved and worshipped like a poet. And yet, for all the failure and the heartbreak piled up across these pages, this is precisely where the central thread we have been following pulls tighter than it ever has before. Because it is through this deeply, undeniably flawed king, and remarkably even through the later son born to him and Bathsheba, a boy named Solomon, that the long-promised line quietly continues to run. And to David, God makes a promise that lifts the entire stakes to a new height. That covenant chain we have been tracing all the way from the very beginning, narrowing steadily from all of humanity down toward a single distant point, now reaches the throne itself. God pledges that David's royal house and kingdom will endure, and that his throne will be established forever. From this moment on, the promised deliverer the whole story has spent so long chasing finally has a return address. He will come from the line of David. The funnel has tightened one more crucial notch, and the future king the entire library has been building toward, page after page and book after book, will be a son of this shepherd who became a monarch, flaws, failures, and all. The son who inherited all of that promise was Solomon, and for one shining stretch he made it look as though the story might actually have stumbled onto its happy ending several thousand pages early. Under him, the kingdom his father had painstakingly knit together did not merely hold, it soared. This is the golden age in its fullest bloom, the absolute high-water mark of the entire nation, and the books that chronicle it, known simply as Kings, open on a summit so lofty that nearly everything afterward can only be described as the long climb down. Solomon's reign begins with one of the more genuinely appealing decisions any ruler in the whole collection ever makes. Early on, God offers him what amounts to a blank check, an open invitation to ask for whatever he most wants. A younger or greedier man might have requested a long life, or heaps of riches, or the swift destruction of his enemies. Solomon instead asks for wisdom, the discernment to govern such an enormous people well. It is the ancient equivalent of being offered any prize in the entire store and choosing the one that quietly makes you better at your job, and it goes over extremely well. Pleased that he asked for the unselfish thing, God grants him the wisdom and then throws in all the rest as an unrequested bonus, the wealth and the honor and the sweeping power he had pointedly declined to ask for. It is a rare instance of someone ordering the modest option off the menu and being quietly upgraded to everything on it. That wisdom swiftly became the stuff of legend, and the book serves up a famous demonstration of it in action. 2 women came before Solomon, each fiercely claiming to be the mother of the same infant, with no possible way to prove which of them was telling the truth. Solomon, rather than agonizing over it, calmly proposed cutting the child in 2 and awarding half to each of them, purely to observe how they would react. The genuine mother instantly surrendered her claim in order to save the baby's life, while the impostor was perfectly content to see it divided, and Solomon naturally had his answer in an instant. It was a shrewd piece of psychology dressed up as a shocking proposal, and word of that kind of insight spread far and wide, eventually drawing curious visitors from distant lands, including a celebrated foreign queen who traveled an enormous distance simply to test his reputation with hard questions and went home thoroughly impressed. Solomon's wisdom was not confined to clever courtroom rulings either. Tradition credits him with composing a vast body of sayings, songs, and reflections, and a good deal of the collection's later wisdom literature, the Proverbs and Meditations we will come to in time, is attributed directly to him. He was, in his prime, not merely a shrewd judge, but a kind of philosopher-king, cataloging observations about nature, human behavior, and the difficult art of living well, which only makes his eventual decline more poignant, since a man who wrote so extensively on the surpassing value of wisdom went on to furnish one of history's clearest demonstrations of what happens when you quietly stop taking your own advice. Along with the wisdom came the wealth, and here the figures grow almost comical. Solomon's kingdom became so staggeringly rich that, in the book's own splendid understatement, silver was regarded as basically worthless during his reign. Not because it had actually lost value, but because gold had become so abundant at court that plain silver was hardly worth the trouble of counting. The palace dripped with luxury, trade flowed in from every direction, and the nation reached a height of prosperity and international standing it had never known before, and would never quite touch again. For a while, the kingdom was the envy of the entire region, which is a perfectly pleasant place for a nation to sit right up until the moment it makes you a target. Solomon's crowning achievement, though, was not the treasure but a building. He constructed the first great temple in Jerusalem, finished around 960 years before the Common Era, and it was the direct fulfillment of the ambition his father had been forced to hand down to him. This was the permanent house we heard about earlier, the fixed and magnificent replacement for the portable tent that had sheltered the presence of God ever since the wilderness. No more packing everything up and moving along. After centuries of a God who traveled alongside a wandering people, there was now a settled, gleaming home at the very heart of the nation's life, and the ancient chest, the ark, was carried in and set down at its center. Symbolically, it was the moment the long journey that began in a garden and continued through a tent finally arrived at something resembling permanence. The distance between God and people that had opened up so very long ago seemed, at last, to have narrowed nearly to nothing. The scale of the undertaking was genuinely immense. The temple took roughly 7 years to complete and was built from the finest imported cedar and carefully dressed stone, its interior overlaid with gold, and its dedication was accompanied by ceremony on an enormous scale. Alongside it, Solomon raised a sprawling palace complex that took even longer to finish, together with fortifications, cities, and trade infrastructure spread across the kingdom. All of this grandeur, however, was ruinously expensive, and it was paid for not only in gold but in the sweat of the population, funded through steep taxes and gangs of conscripted labor. It is worth filing that detail away because the resentment quietly accumulating underneath all that glittering construction is precisely what will detonate the instant Solomon is gone, which is, of course, precisely when it all began to unravel. Because for all his celebrated wisdom, Solomon turned out to be spectacularly unwise in one particular department. Over the years, he accumulated an enormous number of wives, a great many of them foreign princesses acquired mainly to seal political alliances, and each of them arrived carrying her own gods along in her luggage. And slowly, in his later years, the wisest man in the world allowed those influences to draw his heart away from the very God who had made him wise in the first place. He began quietly accommodating the worship of other gods, building shrines for them, hedging his spiritual bets. It is a quietly devastating turn. The man who had everything and knew better than anyone gradually compromising it all away. And it demonstrates a principle the story keeps insisting upon. Wisdom in the abstract counts for very little indeed if you do not actually bother to live by it. That old warning about comfort and success being more spiritually dangerous than hardship comes true in the single most impressive life the nation ever produced. There is a quiet irony worth flagging here too. Remember those rules laid down long ago for a future king, the ones warning him not to pile up gold, not to accumulate horses and chariots, and above all, not to take many wives who would gradually turn his heart away. Solomon, the wisest king of them all, managed to break every last one of them, and comprehensively at that. He amassed legendary gold, built a vast force of chariots and horses, and took foreign wives by the hundreds. The warning label had been drafted centuries in advance, addressed almost pointedly to a man exactly like him, and he proceeded to ignore it item by item. It is one of the clearest cases in the whole collection of the fine print coming true precisely as it was written. The bill for all of this came due the moment Solomon died, and it came due with brutal speed. His son Rehoboam inherited the throne, and one of the very first things he faced was a straightforward request from the people. Solomon's grand building projects and lavish court had been funded by heavy taxes and forced labor, and the people simply asked the new king to ease the burden a little. It was a reasonable request, and the older, wiser advisors urged Rehoboam to grant it and secure the people's loyalty for a generation. Rehoboam, unfortunately, listened instead to his young friends and delivered what may well be the single worst answer in the entire history of labor relations, informing the people that far from lightening their load, he intended to make it dramatically heavier, and phrasing it in terms crude enough that we will leave the exact wording to the imagination. It was a catastrophic misreading of the room, the ancient equivalent of responding to a polite request for a raise by announcing a pay cut and an insult in the same breath. And the reaction was immediate. The 10 northern tribes promptly walked out and refused to recognize him as their king at all. And so the United Kingdom, the great achievement of David and the shining glory of Solomon, tore cleanly down the middle, and it never came back together again. The northern portion, keeping the name Israel, went its own way under a leader named Jeroboam, carrying 10 of the tribes with it. The southern portion, now called Judah and centered firmly on Jerusalem, stayed loyal to the line of David under Rehoboam, holding on to the temple and the ancestral capital. From this point onward, the story runs along 2 parallel tracks, 2 rival kingdoms, occasionally at peace and far more often at each other's throats, and the book toggles restlessly between them as it charts both of their long, grinding declines. Jeroboam, ruling the north, faced an immediate strategic problem. The temple, the great center of worship, sat squarely in the rival southern capital, and he could hardly have his people regularly traveling down to Jerusalem to worship lest their political loyalty quietly drift south along with them. So he set up alternative worship sites within his own territory, complete with golden calf images, which is a detail that should ring a very loud and very unfortunate bell. The nation had traveled this exact road once before, at the foot of a certain mountain, and it had not ended well then either. It set the spiritual tone for the entire northern kingdom, which the book portrays as compromised essentially from the moment of its birth. What follows across both kingdoms is one of the more relentlessly discouraging stretches in the whole collection, a long procession of monarchs that reads, in all honesty, like an endless string of disappointing performance reviews. The book assesses each ruler by a single measure, whether or not they stayed faithful, and the verdicts come back overwhelmingly negative, especially up north, where not one single king manages to earn a passing grade. There are coups, assassinations, short-lived dynasties, and rulers who barely last a week before someone quietly removes them and helps himself to the crown. It is political instability elevated into a way of life, and the sheer volume of failed kings begins to blur together after a while, which is very much the point. Without faithful leadership at the top, the whole enterprise is visibly rotting from the head down. There was, however, one persistent counterweight running against all these failing kings, and it is worth naming clearly. because it becomes enormously important later on. Alongside the monarchy, the entire time ran a stream of prophets, figures raised up not to rule but to confront, to serve as the conscience of the nation and to call the kings back whenever they wandered. A prophet was, in effect, an unwelcome truth-teller with no army and no throne, armed with nothing but a message, and the relationship between kings and prophets was almost always tense, since nobody in power has ever particularly enjoyed being told they have gone wrong. These prophets are the ones who will eventually fill the final and largest stretch of the entire collection. But the tradition begins right here, in the thick of the monarchy, with confrontations like the one about to unfold. Amid all this dreariness, though, the story throws up its single most colorful royal villain and, in direct response, one of its very greatest heroes. The villain is a northern king named Ahab, and honestly, the more memorable half of that partnership is his wife, a foreign princess named Jezebel, whose name has echoed down the centuries ever since as a byword for ruthless, scheming wickedness. Together, they were the power couple nobody in their right mind wanted, aggressively promoting the worship of a foreign god named Baal, persecuting anyone still loyal to the God of Israel, and generally driving the northern kingdom into the spiritual ground with real, sustained enthusiasm. They were, by the book's account, roughly as bad as the monarchy ever got, which in a lineup this crowded with poor kings is genuinely saying something. Rising up to stand against them is the towering figure of Elijah, one of the most dramatic prophets anywhere in the collection. Elijah confronts Ahab directly and announces, on God's authority, that no rain whatsoever will fall on the land for years. A devastating drought aimed squarely at exposing the utter powerlessness of the weather god the royal couple had been so busy promoting. The drought duly arrives and drags on, and Elijah himself survives it through a series of small, pointed wonders, at one stage being fed by ravens out in the wilderness, at another sustained by a desperately poor widow whose tiny supply of flour and oil somehow never runs dry no matter how much of it she uses. A quiet running detail that makes its own understated point about who is actually doing the providing around here. The confrontation reaches its climax in one of the most theatrical showdowns in the entire story, staged high on a mountain called Carmel. Elijah publicly challenges the hundreds of prophets of Baal to a contest with the whole nation watching. Each side would prepare an offering and call upon their god to answer with fire from heaven, and whichever god actually bothered to respond would settle the question of who was real, permanently and for everyone to see. The prophets of Baal go first, and they call and dance and plead and work themselves into a frenzy for hours on end, and absolutely nothing happens. Elijah, watching all this unfold, simply cannot resist, and offers up what may be the most delightfully sarcastic commentary in the whole collection, helpfully suggesting they try shouting a little louder in case their god happens to be deep in thought, or busy with something, or away traveling, or perhaps just fast asleep and in need of a good wake-up call. It is dry, merciless mockery, and the total silence from the heavens only sharpens it. Then Elijah takes his own turn, and for good measure drenches his entire offering in water first to remove any possible doubt about trickery, calls out once, and fire falls from the sky and consumes everything, water included. The contest is not remotely close. It is a total, unambiguous demonstration, and for one bright moment the tide genuinely seems to turn, for one moment and only one, because the very next thing that happens is deeply human and rather unexpected. Instead of riding the triumph of Carmel to a decisive victory, Elijah is immediately threatened by a furious Jezebel, and astonishingly buckles. The same prophet who had just called fire down from the sky in front of an entire nation now flees for his life into the wilderness, collapses under a solitary bush, and, utterly exhausted and despairing, asks to die on the spot. It is a striking portrait of burnout, the crushing crash that so often follows a great high, and the story handles it with real gentleness. Elijah is fed, allowed to sleep, and then met by God not in wind or earthquake or fire, as you might reasonably expect after Carmel, but in a low, gentle whisper, a quiet reassurance that he is nowhere near as alone as he feels. It is one of the tenderest moments in a book otherwise full of thunder. Elijah's own story ends every bit as dramatically as it unfolded, because he does not, as it happens, die in the ordinary way at all. Instead, according to the account, he is swept up in a whirlwind and carried off in what is described as a chariot of fire, making him one of only a small handful of figures in the whole collection to exit the stage without an ordinary death. Before he goes, he passes his mantle to a chosen successor named Elisha, who had specifically asked for a double portion of his master's spirit. And Elisha, fittingly enough, goes on to perform a long string of wonders, reportedly even more numerous than Elijah's own, ranging from purifying a poisoned water source to multiplying scarce food to, in one memorably strange miracle, causing a lost iron axe head to bob up and float on the surface of a river so it could be fished out and returned to its embarrassed owner. The prophetic tradition, at the very least, remained vividly and stubbornly alive even as the monarchy around it steadily crumbled to pieces. One of Elisha's encounters is worth singling out because it quietly echoes a theme the story keeps returning to. A powerful foreign army commander named Naaman, afflicted with a dreaded skin disease, came seeking a cure, and Elisha instructed him, without much ceremony at all, simply to go and wash 7 times in an unimpressive local river. Naaman was at first genuinely offended by how underwhelming the prescription was, having expected something grander and more dramatic befitting a man of his rank. But when he finally swallowed his pride and did exactly as he was told, he was completely healed. It is a small story carrying a surprisingly large point that healing and grace were available even to an outsider, an enemy officer no less, and that they arrived through humble obedience rather than impressive spectacle. Once again, the collection deliberately reaches past the expected insiders to include the foreigner nobody would have picked. But crumble it did, and no quantity of prophetic fireworks could reverse the overall direction of travel, which was relentlessly, grindingly downward. The Northern Kingdom, spiritually compromised from its founding and never once genuinely course-correcting, ran clean out of road first. Around 722 years before the Common Era, the rising empire of Assyria swept in, crushed the northern kingdom of Israel entirely, and carried its people off into captivity, scattering them so thoroughly and mixing them so completely with other populations that they largely disappeared from the historical record altogether. 10 of the original tribes simply gone. It was the first great catastrophe of its kind, and it should have served as an absolutely unmistakable warning to the southern kingdom watching the whole thing play out next door. It did not, on the whole, take the hint. Judah, the southern kingdom, staggered on for well over another century, and it lasted that much longer in large part because it occasionally produced a genuinely good king who briefly reversed the decline. One such king, named Hezekiah, undertook serious reforms and famously held firm when the same Assyrian war machine that had devoured the north came knocking at Jerusalem's gates, only for the siege to collapse without the city ever falling. Another, a young king named Josiah, launched a sweeping religious housecleaning after a remarkable discovery. While repairs were being carried out on the neglected temple, workers stumbled upon a long-lost scroll of the law, the very book of instruction that had been all but forgotten. Reading it reduced the young king to grief at how far the nation had strayed, and he threw himself into reform, which is a rather striking illustration of that earlier point about how much later generations kept turning back to that particular book whenever they wanted to find their way home. But these bright spots, however sincere, were always temporary and never quite enough to reverse the long slide for good, because eventually the next great empire in the sequence arrived to finish what Assyria had started. In the year 586 before the Common Era, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar besieged and captured Jerusalem, and this time there was no last-minute reprieve. The city was taken, and the great temple, Solomon's crowning glory, the permanent house of God that had stood for centuries as the beating heart of the entire nation, was burned to the ground. The people of Judah were rounded up and marched off into a long exile in Babylon, hundreds of miles from the only home they had ever known. It is worth saying, before we sink fully into the gloom, that the exile was not quite the total annihilation it first appears to be. The people were displaced, not erased. Communities of exiles put down roots in Babylon, held tightly onto their identity, and in some cases even climbed into positions of real influence within the very empire that had conquered them, a development that will go on to produce some of the most famous stories still ahead of us. But that is to look forward. In the immediate aftermath, sitting beside foreign rivers and staring back toward a ruined homeland, it certainly felt like the end of absolutely everything, and the collection is in no hurry to soften that grief. And with that, the whole trajectory of the story appears to reverse and cave in on itself. Consider just how far this has now fallen. The journey that began in a flawless garden, that survived slavery and a wilderness, that clawed its way up to a united kingdom and a glorious temple, now ends with that temple in ashes, the people torn from their land, and a foreign empire ruling contentedly over the ruins. Everything the nation had been given, the land, the throne, the very house of God, has been stripped clean away. The people sit separated from their home, and so it seems from their God, captives in a strange country, quietly wondering how on earth it had all gone so catastrophically wrong. It is, on the surface of it, the darkest single moment in the entire collection, the apparent undoing of every promise ever made. That grim catalog of consequences Moses had spelled out generations earlier, the fine print nobody ever wanted to read, has now come true almost point by point. And that is exactly the low, bleak spot at which we need to pause the narrative for a while and pull the camera back, because to grasp how this small nation kept ending up crushed between one empire after another, you first have to understand the map. None of this, you see, happened in a vacuum. All those armies that kept rolling over the land, all those empires with their intimidating names, they were not a run of random misfortunes. They were the direct and predictable result of geography, of exactly where this small nation happened to have been planted, and once you can see the map clearly, an enormous amount of the story abruptly makes far more sense. So let us do something the story itself never once stops to do, and take in the whole region from high above. The setting for very nearly everything we have covered so far is a broad arc of fertile, farmable land that historians call the Fertile Crescent, a great curving band of green sweeping across an otherwise harsh and mostly arid corner of the world. Picture a crescent moon lying on its side with its two tips pointing gently downward, and you have roughly the right shape in your head. This arc was where civilization in this part of the world first took root, for the wonderfully simple reason that it was where crops would actually grow. And wherever crops grow reliably, people gather, villages swell into cities, and cities eventually harden into empires. It is, quite literally, the cradle of a large share of early human history. And it is no accident that our story unfolds inside it. At one end of that crescent sat the region the Greeks would later name Mesopotamia, a word that means, quite literally, the land between the rivers. Those two rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the rich soil laid down between them nourished some of the earliest and most formidable civilizations humanity has ever produced. This was the cradle from which several of the great empires in our story would emerge, including both of the ones we have just watched come crashing down on the two kingdoms. At the far other end of the picture, down along the northeastern corner of Africa, lay Egypt, a civilization strung out in a long, thin ribbon along the banks of a single mighty river, the Nile, whose reliable annual flooding transformed a strip of otherwise lifeless desert into some of the most productive farmland to be found anywhere on Earth. Two enormous zones of wealth and power then, one in the east between the rivers and one to the southwest along the Nile. And here is the single crucial detail, the one that quietly explains almost everything else. Between those two great centers of power, forming the natural land route connecting them, ran a narrow strip of territory along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. That narrow strip was Canaan, the promised land, the home of our entire story, which means the nation we have been following did not settle down in some quiet, out-of-the-way corner where it could develop in peace and privacy. It settled directly on the main road running between the superpowers. Any army marching from Mesopotamia toward Egypt or from Egypt back toward Mesopotamia, and over the long centuries there were a very great many of them, had no choice but to pass straight through this land. It was, in the most literal sense imaginable, a highway, and the nation had gone and built its home right in the middle of it. It is a spectacular piece of real estate if what you value is trade and travel, and an absolutely catastrophic one if what you actually want is to be left in peace. Picture trying to raise a quiet family home on the median strip of a busy motorway, and you begin to appreciate the fundamental problem. This one geographical fact, more than any other single thing, explains why the people found themselves trampled over and over again. They were not merely unlucky. They were living precisely where every ambitious empire on the map needed to walk. The crossroads did not only bring armies, to be fair about it, it also brought trade, travelers, and a constant flow of goods and ideas moving back and forth between the great centers, which meant the little land in the middle was unusually exposed to outside cultures and, crucially, their gods. This cut both ways in the story. On one hand, it made the nation cosmopolitan and connected, a genuine meeting point of the ancient world. On the other, it meant a relentless stream of foreign influences and temptations washing continually through, which goes a long way toward explaining why holding onto a distinct identity and a single God kept proving such a constant, uphill struggle. When you happen to live on everyone's highway, everyone's culture comes strolling through your front door, whether you invited it in or not, which carries us naturally to those empires because the later history of the whole collection is essentially governed by a sequence of them, handed off one after another like runners passing a baton in a relay race. Understanding the order of that relay makes the entire back half of the story quietly click into place. It begins with Egypt, the great early power to the southwest, which looms over the earliest chapters, most obviously across the era of slavery and the Great Escape. Then, as Egypt's dominance slowly faded, the balance of power shifted east, and the first of the great Mesopotamian empires rose to terrifying prominence. Assyria, a military machine of legendary brutality, and the empire that, as we just saw, swallowed the northern kingdom whole around 722. Assyria's turn at the summit did not last forever either. It was in due course conquered and replaced by Babylon, also rising up out of Mesopotamia, the empire under whose king the southern kingdom finally fell, and the temple burned in 586. And Babylon too would have its own day abruptly cut short because still further to the east a new power was quietly gathering that would shortly overtake it entirely: Persia. Persia matters enormously for where the story travels next, so it is worth flagging clearly right now. Around 538 years before the Common Era, the Persian Empire under a king named Cyrus conquered Babylon, and Cyrus adopted a strikingly different policy toward captive peoples than the empires before him had. Rather than keeping conquered exiles scattered and displaced, he permitted them to return to their homelands and rebuild. It was, in part, shrewd imperial management, since a contented, self-governing subject people is far less likely to rise up in revolt than a bitter and displaced one. But whatever the underlying motive, the effect on the exiles of Judah was the same. For the people of Judah, sitting in exile with their beloved city and temple in smoking ruins, this was the utterly unexpected turning of the tide, the very first crack of light after the darkest chapter of all, and it quietly sets up everything that comes in the long aftermath of the exile. The relay then runs cleanly and in order: Egypt, then Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, each one rising, dominating, and then giving way to the next in line. And here's the detail truly worth holding on to because it sits at the very center of how this story understands itself. These empires are never once presented as random accidents of history. The prophets, whom we are about to meet properly, repeatedly name these very powers in advance, casting each one not as a meaningless catastrophe, but as another deliberate turn in a story that remains firmly under control, even when it looks like nothing but pure chaos from down at ground level. This reframing mattered far more than it might sound, because there was a dangerous question lurking under the rubble of the burned temple. By the ordinary logic of the ancient world, when one nation conquered another, it generally meant that the victor's gods had defeated the losers, and by that reasoning, the destruction of the temple should have marked the quiet end of the nation's faith altogether. But the people had been carefully prepared over generations for a completely different interpretation. Their own prophets had been warning all along that disaster, if it ever came, would not be a sign that their God had lost, but a direct consequence of the nation itself breaking the agreement it had made, exactly as that old catalog of curses had promised it would. The exile, in other words, was to be understood not as defeat, but as discipline, and that single shift in framing is what kept the faith alive in Babylon instead of dissolving it into thin air. It is a subtle but genuinely decisive difference, and it is the reason the story is able to continue at all. There is a strange and important twist folded into all of this, one the collection will develop further later. The catastrophe of exile turned out to be, against every expectation, one of the most spiritually productive periods the nation ever passed through. Cut off from their temple, their land, and their kings, the people were forced to work out what it actually meant to belong to their God, with none of the usual props to lean on, no sacrifices, no sacred building, no throne. A great deal of the collection was very likely gathered, preserved, and shaped during this exact stretch. Sometimes, it seems, a people learns the most precisely when it has lost the most, which is not an especially comfortable lesson, but it is a stubbornly recurring one. There is also one more contrast between these empires worth understanding, because it neatly solves a real historical puzzle. Why the northern kingdom vanished forever while the southern kingdom eventually made it home. The Assyrians, who took the north, practiced a deliberate policy of dissolving conquered peoples, scattering them widely across the empire and importing other populations to replace them, a strategy purpose-built to erase local identity and stamp out any future rebellion. It worked all too well. The northern tribes were absorbed and effectively disappeared from history. The Babylonians, who later took the south, operated rather differently, tending to relocate whole populations more or less intact, which meant the exiles from Judah could remain a distinct community, keep their traditions alive, and hold on to the hope of an eventual return. That single difference in imperial policy, dry and bureaucratic as it sounds, is the entire reason there was still a recognizable people left to go home when the chance finally came. It also helps enormously to pin a small handful of key cities onto this mental map, because the very same names will keep resurfacing and it becomes easy to lose track of which one belongs where. In the homeland itself, there is Jerusalem, capital of the southern kingdom of Judah, home of David's throne and Solomon's temple, and unquestionably the single most important city in the whole collection. To its north, serving as the capital of the breakaway northern kingdom of Israel, stood a city called Samaria, whose name would eventually attach itself to a whole surrounding region and its people. Moving outward to the empires, the Assyrian war machine was directed from a great and notorious capital called Nineveh, a city that will turn up quite memorably later on, when a very reluctant prophet gets sent there and does absolutely everything in his power to wriggle out of the assignment. Further along again sat Babylon itself, the glittering imperial capital where the exiles from Judah were held, a city that gradually becomes almost a symbol of exile and captivity all on its own. And finally, far away to the east, there was Susa, one of the great cities of the Persian Empire, and worth noting now because it becomes the stage for one of the most remarkable stories still lying ahead of us, in which a young woman drawn from among the exiles rises all the way to become queen at the very heart of the empire, and ends up saving her entire people from destruction. Keep that particular city filed away. For the moment, simply notice how neatly the geography has organized itself for us. A homeland with two capitals, one north and one south, wrapped on either side by a rotating cast of imperial capitals, each in its turn the beating center of whichever power currently happens to be pressing down on the little land caught in the middle. It helps, too, to hold on to a rough sense of the timescales involved, because these events are dangerously easy to picture as happening in quick succession when in reality they unfolded across centuries. The United Kingdom under David and Solomon lasted only a few generations before it split apart. The divided kingdoms then ran on in parallel for a very long stretch indeed, the north surviving something like 2 centuries before Assyria finally ended it, and the south enduring well over a century longer still before Babylon did the same. And the exile in Babylon itself, that seemingly bottomless low point, would drag on for some 70 years before the road home ever opened. These are not overnight disasters flashing past. They are slow-motion collapses, playing out across the lifetimes of many generations who were born, lived, and died inside them, never seeing how the larger story would resolve. With all of that finally laid out, the shape of the entire later story swims clearly into focus. This is no longer just a bewildering blur of unfamiliar names and dates and disasters. It is the almost entirely predictable fate of a small nation planted on the single busiest crossroads in the ancient world, forever caught up in the churn as one empire after another rose in the east or the southwest and came marching straight through the middle. Understanding this does nothing to make the suffering any smaller, but it does make it comprehensible. The people were not being singled out by some cosmic streak of bad luck. They were simply living on hotly contested ground in a violent and ambitious age. And crucially, seeing the map also shows us exactly where the story is now heading. That lowest point, the bitter exile in Babylon, is not actually the end of anything. Off to the east, the next empire in the relay is already quietly rising, and with it, against every reasonable expectation, comes the long road home, which is precisely where the story turns next. and walk it they did. The road home, when it finally opened, led straight into a cluster of books unlike almost anything we have seen so far. Because for the first time in a very long while, the story is no longer about a nation falling apart, but about a broken people painstakingly gluing themselves back together. These are the books of the return, and they cover the unglamorous, deeply human work of rebuilding a shattered identity from the rubble up. There are 4 of them, and taken together they answer a single anxious question that must have haunted every exile lying awake at night. After losing the land, the throne, and the temple all at once, is there even a people left to rebuild? And if there is, who on earth are they now? The first book takes that question of identity head on, and it does so in a way that has been quietly testing the patience of casual readers for centuries. It is called Chronicles, and it opens with what may well be the single most daunting stretch of reading in the entire collection. Roughly 9 straight chapters of pure genealogy, names and then more names, an enormous cascade of who descended from whom, stretching all the way back to the very first man. If you have ever secretly harbored a desire to read 40 generations of largely unpronounceable names in one uninterrupted sitting, this is unquestionably your moment to shine. To a modern reader, it looks, at first glance, like the world's longest and least eventful family tree, or perhaps an ancient telephone directory that nobody thought to put in any useful order. But, and this is the genuinely important thing, those lists were not filler to the people they were written for. They were a lifeline. Picture a community freshly returned from generations of exile, scattered, demoralized, and half convinced that their entire story had simply been erased from the record. To such a people, an unbroken chain of names reaching from the dawn of history right down to their own doorstep was not tedious in the slightest. It was proof. Proof that they still belonged to something ancient and continuous, that the thread had never actually been cut, and that they were the living end of a line stretching back to the very beginning of everything. It was, in effect, the ancient equivalent of handing someone who has lost absolutely everything a document proving exactly who their family is and always has been. Seen that way, the endless roll of names starts to look a good deal less like a chore and a good deal more like a warm and steadying embrace. Beyond those genealogies, Chronicles retells a great deal of the history we have already walked through together, from the rise of the kingdom down to the exile, so there is mercifully no need to march through all of it a second time. What matters is the angle, because Chronicles is very much not a neutral retelling. It is history written with a purpose and a rather noticeable slant. Composed to encourage a discouraged people, it lingers lovingly over the high points, above all on David, the temple, and the worship that surrounded it, while quietly downplaying or skipping past the more embarrassing scandals we saw earlier. That grim business with the loyal soldier's wife, for example, so central to the earlier account of David, receives conspicuously gentle handling here, if it surfaces at all. It is, to put it plainly, something of a highlights reel, a version of the national story carefully edited to remind a demoralized audience of who they had been at their very best rather than to rub their noses in who they had been at their worst. And that editorial choice is less dishonesty than it is a kind of pastoral care. The point Chronicles hammers home over and over is that despite every disaster, God had always intended to dwell right in the midst of his people, which is precisely the reassurance a homeless, templeless community most desperately needed to hear. There is a small but telling detail in how Chronicles chooses to end, too. Rather than closing on the catastrophe of the exile, as the earlier history had, it finishes on a note of pure hope, with the very decree that would allow the exiles to go home. It stops not down in the ashes, but right on the threshold of return, which tells you almost everything about what the book was trying to accomplish. It was written to leave a battered people looking forward rather than back, ending its long procession of kings and disasters on an open door rather than a slammed one. The actual return itself was made possible, as we saw when we stepped back to look at the map, by the great shift in empires. When Persia overtook Babylon, its king reversed the old policy of keeping captives permanently displaced, and instead granted the exiles leave to go home and rebuild. And so, in waves spread across the following decades, they went, trickling back to a homeland many of the younger ones had never personally laid eyes on, only to find their great city in ruins and their sacred temple a scorched and painful memory. The enormous task of rebuilding fell to two very different men, working a couple of generations apart, and the neat division of labor between them is almost comically tidy. One of them tended to the soul of the whole project, and the other handled the bricks. The first of the pair is Ezra, and he was, fittingly enough, a priest and a scholar, the man chiefly responsible for the spiritual restoration of the returned community. His great concern was not walls or gates, but hearts and habits. He threw himself into the effort to re-establish proper worship and, above all, to bring the people back to the law of Moses, which generations of upheaval and exile had left neglected and half forgotten. Under his watch, the temple itself was finally rebuilt and completed around 516 years before the Common Era, a second temple rising slowly on the ruins of Solomon's grand original. It was a genuine triumph, though a decidedly bittersweet one, because the older members of the community who could still just remember the splendor of the first temple reportedly wept openly at the sight of the more modest replacement, a poignant reminder that you cannot always rebuild a thing exactly as it once was. The younger generation, having never seen the original, celebrated wildly and without reservation, so the dedication was apparently an odd and very human mixture of joyful shouting and grieving tears rising up at the same time. Ezra's own signature moment comes when he gathers the whole people together and reads the rediscovered law aloud to them publicly for hours on end. Rather than glazing over or drifting off, the people are moved to tears as they hear, many of them very likely for the first time in their entire lives, what their own foundational instructions actually said. It is a striking scene of a whole community rediscovering its own identity in real time, and it captures the entire thrust of Ezra's mission perfectly. A people cannot truly come home until they first remember who they were always meant to be. If Ezra was the soul of the restoration, the second man was unmistakably its construction foreman. His name was Nehemiah, and he was, of all things, a high-ranking official in the Persian court, a trusted royal cupbearer who heard how badly the walls of Jerusalem still lay in ruins, and was so distressed by the news that he secured both permission and imperial backing to travel home and personally supervise the repairs. Where Ezra tended to the inner life of the people, Nehemiah handled the very literal, physical restoration of the city, and above all, its defensive walls, which for an ancient city were not a decorative luxury, but the plain difference between security and permanent vulnerability to anyone who fancied strolling in. What Nehemiah managed to accomplish with those walls is genuinely remarkable, and it is exactly the sort of statistic that would make a modern project manager openly weep with envy. He organized the entire community and had the walls of Jerusalem rebuilt in a grand total of 52 days. Anyone who has ever watched a perfectly straightforward home renovation stretch from a few weeks into several months and then into an entire lost year will appreciate just how faintly absurd that timeline really is. An entire city wall raised from rubble in under 2 months and without a single power tool anywhere in sight. It is the rare ancient construction project that came in ahead of schedule, which may be the quietest miracle in the whole book. It was not, however, a smooth or peaceful build, because the project faced constant harassment from hostile neighbors who had no interest whatsoever in seeing Jerusalem strong and defensible again. A pair of local officials in particular made it their personal business to mock, threaten, and scheme against the work at every possible turn, deploying what amounts to the ancient equivalent of relentless online trolling, sneering that the wall was so flimsy that a passing fox could knock the whole thing over. When mockery alone failed to stop the work, they escalated to actual threats of armed attack, which forced Nehemiah into one of the more memorable logistical arrangements anywhere in the collection. His workers built with their tools in one hand and a weapon always within reach, laboring away on the wall with a sword strapped to their side, ready to drop their trowels and defend themselves at a moment's notice. It is multitasking under pressure of a sort most of us will thankfully never have to attempt, and yet, sword belts and all, the wall steadily went up. Nehemiah's challenges were not all external either. Partway through the whole project, he discovered that one of the gravest threats to the community was coming from inside it, as wealthier members were quietly exploiting the desperation of their poorer neighbors, lending at crushing rates and effectively driving their own people into debt slavery in the middle of a crisis. Nehemiah was furious, and he forced the wealthy to cancel the debts and return what they had seized, which is a useful reminder that rebuilding a nation is never merely a matter of walls and stones. A community can look perfectly strong on the outside while quietly rotting on the inside, and Nehemiah clearly understood that a fair society had to be rebuilt right alongside the fortifications. Both Ezra's and Nehemiah's efforts build toward the same powerful climax, a great national gathering in which the assembled people recommit themselves, openly confessing where they and their ancestors had gone wrong and formally renewing their commitment to the covenant. It is the spiritual counterpart to all that physical rebuilding, the community not merely restoring its walls and its temple, but deliberately re-anchoring its whole relationship with God. The stones and the souls in the end are restored together, which is rather the point, which leaves the final book of this section, and it is a genuinely unique one, unlike anything sitting around it. It is the story of Esther, and it unfolds not back in the rebuilt homeland at all, but far away, in the glittering heart of the Persian Empire, in that eastern capital we made a point of flagging earlier. It follows a young Jewish woman living among the exiles who never returned home, and it is, at its core, a tense and twist-filled thriller about a plot to wipe out her entire people and the wildly improbable chain of events that ends up thwarting it. It begins, of all things, with a beauty contest. The Persian king, having dramatically dismissed his previous queen for refusing to be paraded in front of his drunken banquet guests, launches a sprawling kingdom-wide search for a replacement which amounts to more or less the ancient version of a lavish reality television competition to crown a brand new royal. A young woman named Esther, an orphan raised by her older cousin Mordecai, is swept up in the search and, against considerable odds, chosen as the new queen, all while carefully keeping her Jewish identity a closely guarded secret on her cousin's shrewd advice. The trouble arrives in the form of a spectacularly arrogant royal official named Haman, who is promoted to a position of enormous power and fully expects everyone to bow low before him as he passes. Mordecai, for reasons of conscience, quietly refuses to grovel, and Haman, rather than simply shrugging off the perceived snub of a single man, spirals into a rage so wildly disproportionate that he resolves to exterminate not merely Mordecai, but every last one of Mordecai's people scattered throughout the entire empire. He manipulates the king into approving a decree for their destruction, and even goes to the trouble of constructing an enormous gallows on which he plans to personally hang Mordecai, savoring the anticipated revenge well in advance. It is villainy of an almost cartoonishly grand scale, and it sets a genocidal clock ticking loudly in the background. What follows is a masterclass in reversal, the particular kind where every trap the villain so carefully lays springs shut on him instead. In one delicious turn of events, the king suffers a bout of insomnia one night, and purely to pass the sleepless hours has the royal records read aloud to him, only to discover that Mordecai had once quietly foiled an assassination plot against him and had somehow never been rewarded for it. The very next morning, Haman arrives at court fully intending to request permission to hang Mordecai, and instead finds himself abruptly ordered by the king to publicly honor the very man he despises, parading his hated enemy through the streets dressed in royal robes. The expression on Haman's face at that moment is, one can only imagine, worth the price of admission all on its own. The true climax, though, belongs to Esther, who is forced to make a genuinely terrifying choice. In order to save her people, she has to approach the king uninvited to plead for them, an act which, under the strict rules of the Persian court, could get her executed on the spot if the king happened not to be in a welcoming frame of mind. Steeling herself, she resolves to go regardless, famously declaring that if she perishes, then she perishes. Her nerve pays off. Through a carefully staged pair of banquets, she gradually exposes Haman's murderous plot to the king and reveals her own hidden identity as one of the very people he has condemned to death. The king's fury turns instantly and completely on Haman, who winds up executed on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. A piece of poetic justice so impossibly tidy that it could have been scripted for the stage. The decree against her people is countered, they are permitted to defend themselves, and catastrophe is averted at the 11th hour. The joyful festival that commemorates this narrow and unlikely escape is called Purim, a name drawn from the ancient word for the lots that Haman had cast to select the very day of destruction, a day that ended up becoming, instead, a day of celebration and survival. It is still marked with feasting and the giving of gifts to this very day, a party built quite literally on the ruins of a genocide that never came off. But the single most remarkable feature of the entire book of Esther is, paradoxically, something that is not in it at all. In this whole tense drama of near genocide and last-second rescue, God is never once mentioned. Not a prayer answered on the page, not a miracle announced, not so much as a single direct reference to the divine anywhere in the text. And this is emphatically not an oversight. It is the entire point of the book, delivered with great and deliberate subtlety. Every other book so far has shown God acting openly and unmistakably, through plagues and parted seas and fire falling from the sky. Esther quietly shows the exact opposite, a story in which nothing overtly supernatural ever happens, in which everything unfolds through coincidence, timing, and sheer human courage, and yet in which the fingerprints of a guiding hand are visible absolutely everywhere to anyone bothering to pay attention. The insomnia striking on precisely the right night, the beauty contest that had placed exactly the right woman in exactly the right position years before she would ever be needed, the whole improbable cascade of lucky breaks arriving in perfect sequence. The book quietly insists that God is just as present in the silence and the apparent coincidences as he ever was in the dramatic miracles, working patiently behind the curtain even at the moments when he seems entirely absent from the stage. For a people who had just endured decades of exile wondering aloud where their God had gone, that was a profoundly reassuring message to receive. And with that, the whole great arc of restoration reaches its resolution. Think back for a moment to the shattered picture we were left with at the very lowest point of the exile. A people violently torn from their land and seemingly from their God, with the temple lying in ashes. By the close of these 4 books, all 3 of those broken pieces have been carefully lifted and set back into place. The people are home, the land is resettled, the temple stands once more, and the relationship with God has been publicly and deliberately renewed. The trio that had been so violently pulled apart, the people, their land, and their God, is reunited at long last, and the stage is quietly reset to something like where it once was. The nation is back, chastened and rebuilt, and wiser for the ordeal, waiting once again, and everything is finally in place for the eventual arrival of the one who was promised so very long ago. But before the story hurries on toward that arrival, the collection does something well worth pausing over. It stops telling stories almost entirely and turns sharply inward. Having spent so many books on the grand external drama of nations and kings and marching empires, it now hands over an entire section to something far more intimate, the inner, emotional life of ordinary human beings standing before God. This is the poetry and wisdom literature, and if the history books are forever asking what happened, these books instead ask what it actually feels like to be a person caught in the middle of it all. There are 5 of them, and they are wildly, almost jarringly different from one another. 5 separate and distinct voices exploring 5 very different dimensions of the human heart. Together they form, in a real sense, the most personal and relatable stretch of the entire collection, because their subject is not ancient geopolitics, but suffering, joy, doubt, love, and the search for meaning, which are all very much the same today as they have ever been. It is worth knowing that this kind of writing, often called wisdom literature, was a recognized genre right across the ancient world, with other cultures producing their own collections of proverbs and their own reflections on suffering and the meaning of life. What sets this particular set apart is the way it filters every one of those universal human questions through the relationship with a single God, so that the search for meaning is never left purely abstract, but always, in the end, deeply personal. The first of them plunges straight into the hardest single question a person can ask, the one that has quietly troubled thoughtful people in every age. Why do good people suffer? This is the book of Job, and it takes on the problem without once flinching. It opens with a strange scene in a kind of heavenly court, where a figure known as the accuser essentially proposes a test. Job is described as the single most upright and blameless man alive, richly blessed in every direction, and the accuser's cynical claim is that Job is only so faithful because his life happens to be so comfortable. Strip away all those blessings, the argument runs, and his devotion will promptly collapse into bitter cursing. Permission for the test is granted, and what follows is genuinely harrowing to read. In rapid, brutal succession, Job loses very nearly everything he has. His wealth is wiped out, his children are killed in a sudden disaster, and his own health collapses into a painful, disfiguring affliction that leaves him sitting in the ashes, scraping miserably at his own sores. Even his wife, watching him suffer, urges him to simply curse God and be done with it, which is perhaps not quite the encouragement he most needed at that particular moment. Job refuses, responding instead that he came into the world with nothing and will leave it with nothing, and asking whether a person should be willing to accept only good things from God and never any hardship at all. It is about as far from a comfortable and blessed life as a human being can possibly fall. And yet, at least at first, Job does not curse God. He grieves bitterly, he openly wishes he had never been born at all. But he does not abandon his integrity, and the central drama of the entire book becomes his desperate, aching attempt to make some kind of sense of a catastrophe that appears to have no cause whatsoever. He is not, unfortunately, left to wrestle with it alone because he has friends. 3 of them turn up, ostensibly to comfort him, and they even begin rather promisingly by sitting with him in sympathetic silence for 7 whole days. Then they open their mouths, and things go steadily downhill from there. What follows is chapter after chapter of the 3 friends confidently explaining to a devastated, grieving man exactly why all his suffering simply must be his own fault. Their logic is rigid and painfully simple. God rewards the good and punishes the wicked, therefore Job must have secretly done something terrible to deserve all of this. And if he would only confess it already, everything could be sorted out and put right. They are, in short, some of the least helpful grief counselors in all of recorded history. Precisely the sort of people who respond to genuine catastrophe with lectures, tidy formulas, and mountains of unsolicited theology. Job, who knows perfectly well that he has done nothing whatsoever to earn this, pushes back hard against all of it, insisting on his innocence and increasingly demanding that God himself finally show up and explain what on earth is actually going on. Eventually, a 4th and younger voice, a man named Elihu, jumps into the argument as well, convinced that the older 3 have thoroughly botched the job and that he can do considerably better, though his lengthy contribution mostly serves to set the stage for the voice that is about to silence everyone in the room at once. And then, remarkably, God does show up, speaking to Job directly out of a great storm. But the answer Job receives is not even remotely the one he had been demanding. God does not explain the reason for the suffering. He does not mention the test or the accuser or offer up any justification of any kind at all. Instead, he responds with a breathtaking barrage of questions of his own, sweeping grandly through the wonders of creation and asking Job, in effect, where exactly he was when the foundations of the world were first laid, whether he can command the morning to dawn, or fathom the hidden depths of the sea, or account for the wild and intricate workings of the natural world. It is not a cruel response, but it is an overwhelming one, and its cumulative effect is to reframe the entire question rather than to answer it. The point being made is not that Job's suffering was somehow deserved, which it plainly was not, but that the full picture is simply vaster than any human mind is built to hold, and that there are dimensions to reality which a person, however righteous, is in no real position to judge. Job's own response is not resentment, but a kind of awed surrender. He never does get his answer, but he gets something the book clearly considers far more valuable, a fresh and staggering sense of who God actually is. The conclusion Job finally arrives at, and the conclusion the whole book presses upon the reader, is that it is genuinely possible, and even wise, to trust the character of God even in the total absence of any explanation. In the end, Job's fortunes are restored, but the book is careful not to present that restoration as the neat reward that ties everything up in a bow, because the real resolution had already happened earlier in the quiet shift from demanding answers to trusting the one who holds them. If Job explores the depths of suffering, the next book explores the entire emotional range of the human spirit, and it does so in song. This is the Book of Psalms, the single largest book in the whole collection, a sprawling anthology of 150 poems and songs gathered into 5 smaller books nested within the one. Roughly half of them are traditionally attributed to David, which brings us neatly back to that earlier glimpse of the shepherd king who fought like a warrior but grieved and worshipped like a poet. This, it turns out, is where all of that raw and complicated musical feeling eventually found its home. What makes the Psalms so enduringly and universally beloved is their sheer, unflinching honesty. This is emphatically not a collection of tidy, polite, well-behaved religious sentiments. It is the full spectrum of human emotion laid completely bare before God, holding absolutely nothing back. There are soaring hymns of pure praise and overflowing gratitude, certainly, but there are also raw cries of grief, furious complaints, desperate pleas for rescue, sharp and unresolved expressions of doubt, and even blunt, almost accusatory demands to know why God appears to be looking the other way. It is, in a real sense, the most emotionally honest playlist ever assembled, giving genuine voice to people at their absolute highest and their lowest and everywhere in between the two. And there is a gentle overall movement across the collection, a slow drift over its enormous span from the darker tones of lament toward the brighter and more resolved notes of praise, almost as though the whole book were quietly modeling a long journey out of despair and up toward hope. Two of the individual psalms are especially worth flagging because they have each become so famous in their own right. There is the 23rd, the beloved poem that opens with the tender image of the Lord as a shepherd, a gentle meditation on being guided, protected, and provided for even while walking through the very darkest of valleys, which has quietly comforted grieving and frightened people for thousands of years running. And then there is the 119th, notable for being the single longest chapter anywhere in the entire collection, an enormous and intricately structured poem devoted entirely to a deep love of and delight in the law, built as an elaborate alphabetical acrostic where each section begins with a successive letter. Between the intimate, personal comfort of the one and the sprawling, patient devotion of the other, the Psalms manage to cover just about every posture a human heart can possibly take before the divine. Beneath all that emotional variety, the Psalms also fall into recognizable types, which helps explain their remarkable staying power. Some are laments, structured cries for help in the middle of trouble. Some are songs of thanksgiving offered up after a rescue. Some are hymns of sheer, overflowing praise. Some are quiet meditations on wisdom. And some are royal songs tied to the king and his reign. Many of them, crucially, were never private diary entries at all, but the actual working hymn book of the whole nation, meant to be sung aloud together in worship, first in the temple and then in gatherings of every kind ever since. That is a large part of why they have endured so stubbornly across the centuries. They were built from the very start to be shared, to place ready-made words in the mouths of people who were struggling to find their own. Where the Psalms handle the heart, the next book turns its attention to the head, or rather to the practical, everyday business of actually living wisely. This is Proverbs, largely a collection associated with Solomon, which carries us right back to that same king whose legendary wisdom we watched both shine brilliantly and eventually fail him in old age. The book is essentially a treasury of short, punchy, endlessly memorable sayings about how to conduct a genuinely good life, covering everything from honesty and hard work to friendship, money, careful speech, and self-control. If the Psalms are an emotional playlist, then Proverbs sits closer to a collection of the ancient world's sharpest and most quotable life advice, precisely the sort of pithy, sticky one-liners that would slot comfortably into a modern feed of daily wisdom and motivational quotes. The whole of Proverbs is organized around a single foundational idea, stated plainly right at the very outset, that the fear of the Lord, meaning a deep reverence and awe toward God rather than mere fright, is the beginning and the very foundation of all real wisdom. Everything else in the book builds outward from that one starting point. One of its more striking literary features is the way it repeatedly personifies wisdom itself as a woman, portrayed as calling out invitingly in the streets and urging people to follow her rather than the seductive and ruinous alternative of folly. And in a genuinely neat piece of composition, the book draws to a close with an extended and admiring portrait of a capable, industrious, and deeply wise woman skillfully managing her household and her affairs, which brings that recurring image of wisdom as a woman full circle, and rounds the whole collection off with a warm, concrete picture of wisdom actually lived out in the texture of an ordinary daily life. And then, right in the middle of all this grounded, practical optimism, the collection takes a sharp and rather startling turn into its single bleakest and most existential book. This is Ecclesiastes, and it reads almost shockingly modern in its mood, the work of a world-weary narrator traditionally understood to be Solomon looking back over the whole span of his life, who has set out to interrogate whether anything in all of existence actually means anything at all. Its famous refrain is usually rendered as "everything is vanity," but the original word carries much more the sense of vapor, breath, or drifting smoke, something you reach out to grasp only to have it slip clean through your fingers and vanish into the air. Everything the narrator gloomily concludes again and again is fleeting and insubstantial, here for one brief moment and then gone. It is also the source of one of the most widely quoted passages anywhere in the whole collection. The famous meditation on how there is a season and a time for every purpose under the sun, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to keep silent and a time to speak. Even people who have never once opened the book have almost certainly heard those lines, often without the faintest idea of where they originally come from. And beneath their gentle poetry sits the book's entire outlook, that life moves in vast rhythms and turning seasons far larger than any single person, and that a good deal of wisdom lies in learning to accept those rhythms rather than exhausting yourself fighting against them. The book is essentially a long, brutally honest experiment in the search for meaning. The narrator methodically works his way through everything a person might reasonably chase in the hope of lasting satisfaction. He tries pleasure, indulging himself in every enjoyment on offer. He tries wealth, piling up riches on a truly staggering scale. He tries great works and achievements, building and planting and accomplishing on a grand scale. He even tries wisdom itself, the diligent pursuit of knowledge and understanding. And one by one, he finds that every single avenue comes up empty in the face of two utterly undefeated opponents: the relentless forward march of time and the flat certainty of death, which eventually erase and level everything alike, so that the wise and the foolish, the rich and the poor, all end up arriving at exactly the same destination regardless. It is a genuinely uncomfortable book, entirely unafraid to stare directly at the futility that most texts would much prefer to glance politely away from. Which is precisely why it resonates so powerfully with anyone who has ever lain awake at 3 a.m. wondering what the point of any of it really is. And yet it does not, in the end, leave the reader stranded out in the void. Its final counsel, arrived at only after all that disillusionment, is quietly and surprisingly grounded. To fear God and keep His commandments, to receive the simple, ordinary pleasures of daily life as genuine gifts rather than distractions, and to live well and gratefully within the boundaries of a life you can neither fully control nor completely comprehend. It is not a triumphant ending by any means, but it is an honest one, and a strangely peaceful one at that. The 5th and final book of this section could hardly stand in sharper contrast to the gloom of the one just before it, and its very presence in a sacred collection tends to catch people off guard. It is the Song of Songs, and it is, quite simply, love poetry, an unabashed and joyful celebration of romantic love between two people, exchanged in the passionate, admiring, and frankly tender language of two lovers utterly delighting in each other. There is no grand battle anywhere in it, no king, no empire, no catastrophe, just the intimate, alternating voices of a couple deeply in love. Many readers across the long centuries have interpreted the whole thing allegorically, reading the mutual devotion of the two lovers as a picture of the love between God and His people, and that reading carries a long and honored history behind it. But the book also stands perfectly well on its own straightforward terms as a warm and genuine celebration of human love and intimacy as something good, beautiful, and deliberately given, rather than as something to be regarded with suspicion or embarrassment. Its inclusion is, in itself, a quiet statement worth noticing. That love and delight between people are not distractions from the sacred, but a real and cherished part of the gift of being alive at all. Taken all together, these 5 books form something quietly remarkable, a kind of emotional and spiritual counterpart to all the sweeping history that came before them. Where the earlier books told us what a whole nation did across the span of 1,000 years, these 5 instead show us how individual human beings actually feel and think and struggle and hope in the presence of God. One wrestles honestly with the mystery of suffering, one gives full voice to the entire range of the heart in song, one offers grounded and practical wisdom for the business of daily living, one stares unflinchingly at the fleeting nature of absolutely everything, and one openly celebrates the beauty and goodness of love. 5 very different books, 5 distinct facets of the same underlying subject, which is simply what it genuinely looks and feels like for a person to speak, honestly and completely and without pretense, with God. And having explored the inner life this thoroughly, the collection is finally ready to turn its attention firmly outward once more and upward toward the towering voices that will carry the whole story to its final, expectant close. Those towering voices are the prophets, and they occupy the final and largest stretch of the whole collection. We have already met the type, running alongside the failing kings as unwelcome truth-tellers, but here they finally step fully into the spotlight and get entire books of their own. Before we dive in, it is worth clearing up what a prophet actually was, because the modern imagination tends to picture someone gazing into a crystal ball and reeling off predictions about the future. That is only a small slice of it. A prophet was, first and foremost, a kind of covenant prosecutor, a person sent to hold up the agreement the nation had made and point out, often at considerable personal risk, exactly where they were breaking it. They did sometimes speak about the future, but usually in service of the present, warning of the consequences that were coming if things did not change, and crucially, holding out real hope of restoration on the far side of judgment. Their books are divided, as we noted a very long way back, into the major and the minor prophets, a distinction that is entirely about the length of the books and has nothing whatsoever to do with importance. The major ones simply wrote more. One more thing is worth holding on to before we meet them one by one, because it is the single most important pattern running through every last one of these books. The prophets almost never deliver pure, unrelieved doom. However harsh the warning, however severe the judgment being announced, there is nearly always a turn toward hope somewhere in the message, a promise that beyond the coming darkness lies restoration. Judgment is never quite the final word. That two-part structure, the hard truth followed by a stubborn, unkillable hope, is the very heartbeat of the entire prophetic section. And once you learn to listen for it, you will hear it repeating in book after book after book. The first and grandest of the major prophets is Isaiah, a sprawling work of 66 chapters that is sometimes affectionately called a miniature version of the whole collection. And not merely because its chapter count happens to echo the number of books in the wider Christian Bible. The resemblance runs a good deal deeper than that because the book falls into two broad halves that neatly mirror the shape of the entire story. The first half is dominated by warning and judgment, a stern message aimed squarely at a complacent Jerusalem drifting cheerfully toward disaster. The second half, by sharp contrast, pivots almost entirely to comfort and consolation, a soaring promise of restoration and hope reaching out beyond the coming catastrophe. Judgment and then comfort, which is precisely the rhythm the whole collection beats out, here compressed into a single book. Isaiah himself prophesied during a genuinely terrifying stretch of history, active while the Assyrian Empire was on the march and personally living through the fall of the northern kingdom and the siege that nearly swallowed the southern one too. So his warnings were never abstract theorizing but urgent commentary on catastrophes unfolding in real time all around him. His own commissioning is one of the most awe-inspiring scenes anywhere in the collection. He describes a vision of God enthroned in overwhelming majesty, attended by strange six-winged beings calling out that God is holy, 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 while the whole place shakes on its foundations and fills with smoke. Overcome by his own smallness and unworthiness in the presence of such holiness, Isaiah is symbolically purified by a burning coal touched to his lips, and only then does he volunteer for the daunting job of being the one voice nobody actually wants to hear. Isaiah is also where several of the most important promises in the entire collection are first clearly sounded, and one chapter in particular deserves special attention. In its 53rd chapter, the book describes the mysterious figure it calls the suffering servant, someone who would be despised, rejected, and ultimately put to death, not for any wrong he himself had done, but to carry the punishment owed by others. He would suffer in their place, the innocent bearing the guilt of the guilty so that they might be healed. The description is unnervingly specific for something set down so long before anyone could have fulfilled it. The servant is pictured as silent before his accusers, like a lamb led away without protest, pierced and crushed, and yet somehow vindicated on the far side of death. That image of a silent lamb dying in the place of others reaches all the way back to the very first Passover and pulls the whole long thread of substitution taut. If that idea sounds strangely familiar by now, it certainly should, because it is the very same principle we first met all the way back in the sacrificial system and the blood-marked doorways of the escape from Egypt, the innocent life given in place of the deserving one. Only here it is lifted clean out of the realm of animals and applied instead to a single coming person. It is one of the most striking and specific portraits anywhere in the collection of the one who had been promised, and we will circle back to it before the end. The same book also holds the promise of a child who would be called Emmanuel, a name that means simply God with us, and it closes on a breathtaking vision of a renewed Jerusalem and even new heavens and a new earth, a total restoration of the harmony that had been lost right back at the beginning in the garden. It is Isaiah, too, who gives us the enduring image of a future age so deeply at peace that swords would be beaten into farming tools, and the fiercest predators would lie down quietly beside their prey, the wolf resting next to the lamb with nothing left in all the world to fear, one of the most hopeful pictures the whole collection ever paints. And there is a fascinating footnote to Isaiah worth flagging here, because a remarkable discovery about this exact book will come back to matter right at the very end of our journey. If Isaiah is the grandest of the prophets, Jeremiah is arguably the most heartbroken. His book is, measured by sheer word count, technically the longest in the entire collection, and its author has come down through history saddled with the fitting nickname of the Weeping Prophet. For something like 40 years, Jeremiah delivered warning after warning to the kingdom of Judah, pleading with it to change course before it was too late. And for something like 40 years, he was comprehensively and consistently ignored. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most thankless jobs imaginable. Roughly the equivalent of shouting an urgent warning into a room where everyone has collectively decided, as a firm matter of policy, not to listen to a single word. His reward for a lifetime of unpopular honesty included being mocked, imprisoned, and, at one especially grim low point, lowered by rope into a muddy, empty cistern and simply left to sink slowly into the sludge at the bottom, which is more or less what the ancient world liked to do with people whose messages it found inconvenient. Jeremiah had not wanted the job in the first place, protesting at his call that he was far too young and no good with words, an objection that was, in the usual fashion, politely overruled. Once in the role, he leaned heavily on vivid symbolic acts to hammer his message home, and 2 episodes in particular capture the strange life he led. On one occasion, when he had his prophecies written out on a scroll and read aloud to the king calmly sliced off the pages one by one and fed them into a fire as they were read to him, which is a remarkably direct way of registering disagreement with a book. Jeremiah, undeterred, simply dictated the whole thing over again, longer the second time. And in perhaps his most poignant act of all, while the Babylonian army was in the very process of besieging Jerusalem and the situation was utterly hopeless, Jeremiah publicly and deliberately bought a field, as a stubborn, defiant sign that despite everything visible in front of him, houses and fields would one day be bought and sold in this land again. Hope, purchased in the middle of a siege. And the truly bitter part, from Jeremiah's own point of view, is that he turned out to be entirely right. He lived long enough to watch the very catastrophe he had spent decades warning about, the fall of Jerusalem itself, unfold in horror right in front of his eyes, which is a sort of vindication absolutely nobody would ever actually want. But his book is not only doom and tears because tucked away inside it sits one of the single most important promises in the whole collection. Jeremiah announces that a day is coming when God will make a brand new covenant with his people, unlike the old one that had been carved onto stone tablets. This one, he says, would be written directly onto human hearts, an inner transformation rather than an external rulebook to be obeyed or broken. In this promised new arrangement, people would know God directly and personally, from the inside out, rather than by consulting a list of external rules, and their failures would be genuinely forgiven and set aside for good, rather than merely papered over year after year. It was the promise of a fundamentally different kind of relationship altogether, and coming when it did from the pen of a man watching the old arrangement collapse in flames, it quietly reframed the entire future the nation could still dare to hope for. Remember that long chain of covenants that has quietly served as our skeleton this entire time, running from the earliest promises down through the great figures of the story? This is the next and climactic link in it, the new covenant that every earlier one had been slowly building toward, and it is announced right here from the pen of a weeping man watching his whole world burn to the ground. Attached to Jeremiah is a short, intense little book of pure grief called Lamentations, and it is precisely what its name suggests it is. It consists of 5 poems mourning the destruction of Jerusalem, and they are crafted with remarkable, almost surprising care. Most of them built as alphabetical acrostics in which each successive section begins with the next letter of the alphabet, as though the poet were quietly determined to grieve thoroughly and in perfect order, all the way from beginning to end. It is sorrow given a rigid, disciplined shape, which is somehow far more moving than raw, formless chaos would have been. And at the very center of all this darkness, buried in the middle poem, sits a single startling flash of light, an affirmation that the mercies of God are never used up but are new every single morning, and that his compassion simply never comes to an end. Placed exactly at the heart of the bleakest book in the whole collection, that one bright line shines all the more brilliantly for the darkness pressing in around it. Then comes Ezekiel, which is, without a great deal of competition, the strangest and most surreal book of the entire set. If the others are largely sermons and poems, Ezekiel frequently reads more like a vivid fever dream. It opens with a genuinely bewildering vision of an immense, otherworldly chariot throne, wheels turning within wheels and covered all over with eyes, carrying the presence of God, an image so bizarre that people have been cheerfully arguing about what it actually describes for thousands of years now. Ezekiel himself was also, to put it as delicately as possible, an unusually committed communicator, given to acting out his prophecies as a kind of elaborate and frequently uncomfortable street theater, performing strange symbolic stunts in public to seize the attention of a people who had long since stopped listening to ordinary words. He was, in effect, the performance artist of the prophets, and a few of his demonstrations would raise eyebrows even today. It helps to know that Ezekiel was delivering all of this from within the exile community in Babylon itself, speaking directly to people who had already been carried off from home, which gives his whole message its particular flavor of grief and distance. As for those uncomfortable demonstrations, one representative example has him lying on his side for an extended stretch of time as a symbolic act meant to bear the guilt of the nation day after day in full public view, which must have made for genuinely strange viewing for the neighbors, and cannot have been remotely comfortable for him either. He committed himself completely to his assignments, whatever they happened to cost him in dignity. The book's most famous scene by far is the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, in which the prophet is shown a vast field littered with the scattered, sun-bleached bones of the long dead, and then watches, presumably in astonishment, as they rattle together, grow flesh and sinew, and rise up into a living army. It is a haunting, cinematic image, one that would not feel remotely out of place in a much later horror film, but its actual meaning is one of pure hope. The seemingly dead and hopeless nation, scattered and lifeless out in exile, would one day be brought back to full life. Ezekiel also carefully traces the movement of God's glory, showing it reluctantly departing from the doomed temple, and then, in the visionary future, returning in splendor to a magnificent new one, whose exhaustively detailed blueprint fills the closing chapters. That distance between God and people which had opened and narrowed so many times across the whole story is, in Ezekiel's grand vision, finally destined to close for good. The last of the major prophets is Daniel, and it is really 2 rather different books bound together into one. The first half is a set of gripping adventure stories set among the exiles in Babylon, following a young man named Daniel and his companions as they struggle to stay faithful while serving in a foreign and often openly hostile royal court. These are some of the most widely known stories in the whole collection, the kind many people can half recall without ever having read them. There is the episode of the blazing furnace, in which 3 of Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, flatly refuse to bow down before a giant golden statue and are hurled into a superheated furnace for their trouble, only to be seen strolling around inside the flames completely unharmed, which is about as dramatic a case of successful fireproofing as history records. There is the famous night Daniel is forced to spend in a den of hungry lions as punishment for the crime of praying, and calmly walks out the next morning perfectly intact, the lions having apparently and quite inexplicably decided to skip the meal entirely. And there is the eerie scene of a disembodied hand appearing to write a cryptic message on a palace wall in the middle of a lavish royal feast, an episode that handed the English language its enduring phrase about seeing the writing on the wall. 2 more of these court stories are worth a mention. Right at the very start, Daniel and his companions quietly decline the rich food and wine of the royal table, requesting a plain diet of vegetables and water instead, and end up looking visibly healthier than everyone else dining on the lavish palace menu, which is either a small miracle or possibly the earliest recorded endorsement of eating your greens. And in one of the more startling episodes, the mighty king Nebuchadnezzar, swollen with pride over his own towering achievements, is suddenly humbled by a spell of madness that drives him out to live in the fields and eat grass like an animal until he finally acknowledges a power far greater than himself, and his sanity is gradually restored to him. It is a pointed little lesson about the perils of pride, delivered directly to the single most powerful man in the world. Sitting alongside these adventures are some genuinely remarkable visions of the future. Early on, the Babylonian king is deeply troubled by a dream of an enormous statue built from 4 different metals, which Daniel interprets as a sequence of 4 successive empires destined to rise and then fall in turn, a striking echo of that very relay of powers we traced when we stopped to look at the map. And in its second half, Daniel shifts gears entirely into strange, symbol-laden visions of the end of the age, populated by fantastic beasts and cosmic figures, among them a mysterious and exalted figure described as one like a son of man, arriving with the clouds of heaven and receiving an everlasting kingdom. That particular phrase, one like a son of man, would go on to take on a life entirely of its own, becoming a loaded and hugely significant title in its own right, one that later readers watched and waited for with keen attention, since it seemed to point toward a figure who was somehow both fully human and yet a great deal more than merely human. Threaded through these visions is a famously precise timetable, a set of numbers that appears to count down toward the arrival of the Promised One, which is a large part of why Daniel became so enormously important to later readers watching the calendar and waiting for the appointed hour. That carries us to the final 12 books, known collectively as the Minor Prophets. And, as already established, minor here refers strictly to length and nothing else. These are 12 genuinely short books, so short that in the Hebrew tradition they were simply bundled together onto a single scroll and counted as one. And they are best taken as a group because for all their surface variety, they largely beat the very same drum, that 2-beat rhythm of judgment followed by hope, which by now should sound thoroughly familiar. Rather than crawl laboriously through all 12 in equal detail, let us hit the highlights, because several of them are genuinely unforgettable. One thing that helps enormously in reading the 12 is knowing that they are spread right across the whole timeline we have already covered, rather than clustered in one single moment. Some of them spoke out before the Great Collapse, warning the 2 kingdoms while there was still time left to change course. Others belong to the era of the exile and its raw immediate aftermath, and a few come from after the return, addressing the rebuilt but discouraged community we met a short while ago. So although they now sit together companionably on one shared scroll, they are really voices calling from very different chapters of the same long story, each one responding to the particular crisis standing directly in front of it. A few of the 12 are built around a single vivid, almost unbearable image. Hosea, for one, was instructed to do something close to unthinkable as a living, breathing sermon. To marry a woman he knew perfectly well would be repeatedly unfaithful to him, so that his own painful marriage would become a walking picture of the nation's unfaithfulness to God, and of a God who, astonishingly, keeps taking his wayward people back regardless. It is a devastating piece of lived-out theology, and it asked an enormous amount of the man required to actually go through with it. Joel takes a real and ruinous plague of locusts, stripping the land bare, and uses it as a vivid picture of a coming day of reckoning, what he calls the day of the Lord, while also promising a future outpouring of God's Spirit on all sorts of people. And Amos, a rough countryman rather than a polished professional holy man, thunders with real fury against the comfortable wealthy who trample the poor underfoot, insisting bluntly that no amount of impressive religious ceremony can ever paper over plain injustice and exploitation. Others take deliberate aim at specific targets. Obadiah, the shortest book in the entire collection at a mere 21 verses, so brief you could genuinely miss it if you blinked, delivers a focused judgment against a neighboring people descended from an old family rival of the nation, condemning their arrogance and their cruelty. Nahum describes the downfall of the brutal Assyrian capital, that same great city whose war machine had once swallowed the northern kingdom whole, and its ruin is presented as long overdue justice finally arriving. And then there is Jonah, easily the most entertaining of the 12, and the reluctant prophet we deliberately flagged a while back. Sent to go and preach a warning to that very Assyrian capital, Jonah wants absolutely nothing to do with the assignment, and rather than obey, he promptly flees by boat in the exact opposite direction. This does not go well for him. He ends up thrown overboard in a violent storm and swallowed whole by an enormous fish, spending 3 memorable days in its belly reconsidering his recent life choices before being unceremoniously deposited back onto dry land. And here's the genuinely funny part. When Jonah finally does trudge off and deliver his warning, and the wicked city actually repents and is spared, he is absolutely furious about it. He sulks, openly resentful that his hated enemies have received mercy, and the book ends with God gently pointing out just how absurd it is to sit there rooting for an entire city's destruction. It is a short, sharp comedy carrying a serious point about the sheer, uncomfortable breadth of divine mercy, extending even to the people we would frankly much rather see punished. Several of the 12 are best remembered for a single luminous line. Micah predicts that a ruler would one day emerge from the small, unremarkable town of Bethlehem, a detail that will matter enormously very soon, and also boils the entire demanding law down into one famously simple summary: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Habakkuk wrestles openly and honestly with the timeless, aching question of why evil so often seems to prosper and go completely unpunished, and arrives at a hard-won conclusion that the righteous person will live by faith, a line that would go on to echo powerfully through later history. Zephaniah returns to the theme of a coming day of judgment, but with the reassuring promise of a faithful remnant preserved safely through it. And Haggai, addressing the very returned exiles we met in the previous section, delivers a wonderfully pointed rebuke, scolding the people for busily paneling and furnishing their own comfortable houses while the rebuilding of God's house sat neglected and unfinished, which is about as blunt a comment on badly misplaced priorities as the entire collection has to offer. It is worth noting, in passing, just how far some of these short books have echoed down the years. The fierce demands for justice voiced by figures like Amos and Micah, insisting that how a society actually treats its poorest and most vulnerable members matters far more than any quantity of impressive religious ceremony, have gone on to inspire reformers and movements for social justice for centuries, right up into modern times. For a set of books that most people have honestly never read, the Minor Prophets have left a surprisingly large and durable footprint on the moral imagination of the wider world. The final 2 of the 12 are the most forward-looking of all. Zechariah strings together a whole series of strange, dreamlike visions and, crucially for what is coming, predicts a future king who would enter the city of Jerusalem, not on a mighty warhorse but humbly, riding on a lowly donkey, an oddly specific image well worth keeping in mind. Zechariah's visions run stranger and deeper than that single picture, taking in a coming shepherd who would be rejected by his own flock and even the oddly precise detail of a betrayal priced at 30 pieces of silver, scattered fragments that later readers would find pointing in one very particular direction. And finally, there is Malachi, which carries the distinction of formally closing the entire Old Testament. It takes the form of a slightly weary back and forth between God and a jaded, indifferent people who keep answering every single accusation with a defensive and faintly exasperated question about what they could possibly have done wrong, the ancient portrait of a relationship gone thoroughly cold. But before it ends, Malachi makes one final promise, that before the great day finally arrives, God would send a messenger ahead to prepare the way, a figure operating in the spirit of that fiery old prophet Elijah who had once called fire down from the sky on a mountaintop. And with that promise of a coming forerunner delivered around 430 years before the Common Era, the Old Testament falls completely silent. That silence is exactly where our final task begins, because now that we have walked the entire length of this 1,000-year road together, we can at last stand back and take in the single thread that has been quietly running through the whole of it from the very first page. Because scattered across these 39 books, tucked away inside stories and poems and prophecies written centuries apart by people who never once met one another, is a long series of clues. And when you finally line them all up side by side, they assemble into a single, astonishingly detailed portrait of a person who had not yet arrived. Consider the trail as a whole. It begins in the opening pages with that cryptic first promise back in the garden that a descendant of the woman would one day crush the source of all the trouble. It narrows steadily, exactly as we watch through the covenant funnel, down to one specific family line, that of Abraham, then to one specific tribe, that of Judah, and then to one specific royal house, that of David, whose throne had been promised to endure forever. The prophet Micah pins down the actual birthplace, the little town of Bethlehem. Isaiah supplies the most haunting details of them all, the child to be called God with us, and, above everything else, the suffering servant who would die in the place of the guilty. Zechariah adds the peculiar and precise image of a humble king arriving on a donkey. And Malachi provides the final piece, the messenger who would come first to prepare the way ahead of him. Taken one at a time, spread thinly across all those different books, each of these is only a hint, a stray fragment, easy enough to overlook entirely. But laid out together, side by side, they compose a remarkably specific composite sketch, a detailed description of who the promised one would be, where he would come from, what exactly he would do, and even how he would suffer to do it. The entire Old Testament, it turns out, has been patiently drawing this one portrait the whole time, without ever quite finishing it. What makes this genuinely striking is that no single author ever sat down and planned it out. These clues were laid down by dozens of different hands across the better part of 1,000 years, by shepherds and kings and priests and exiles who could not possibly have coordinated with one another, many separated by centuries, and yet the fragments converge as though they somehow had. Whatever a person ultimately makes of that fact, it is a remarkable feature of the collection, and it is precisely the thread that turns 39 scattered and very different books into one single forward-leaning story. And that unfinished portrait sits right at the end of the great chain of covenants that has been the true backbone of the story from the very beginning. Each link in that chain, remember, deliberately narrowed the focus a little further. A promise made to all of humanity, then to one family, then to one nation, then to one royal dynasty. And finally, the promise, delivered through Jeremiah, of a new covenant written directly onto the heart. Every single one of those agreements was quietly pointing forward, each one visibly incomplete on its own, each one leaving the reader waiting for the figure who would somehow fulfill all of them at once. The skeleton, in other words, was always leaning hard toward a single conclusion that it never actually reached within these pages. It is worth pausing here just to appreciate the sheer sweep of the journey we have traced together. We began in a perfect garden and watched it lost. We followed a single family down into slavery and back out again through a parted sea, across a long wilderness, and finally into a promised land. We saw that land won, then fractured, then squandered by a long line of failing kings, until it was burned and its people carried off into exile, and then, against every reasonable expectation, restored. We heard the nation sing and doubt and grieve and hope in turn. And through every single twist of it, one promise kept quietly surfacing, narrowing, sharpening, and stubbornly refusing to be forgotten. That is the true shape of the whole thing. One enormous 1,000-year arc bending slowly and steadily toward a single point on the horizon. Before we get to that unreached conclusion, though, it is worth pausing for a moment on a question people quite naturally ask. How do we even know this enormous, ancient collection has reached us intact and was not hopelessly garbled beyond recognition over the many thousands of years of being copied out by hand? It is a completely fair question, and the answer is genuinely reassuring. The texts were preserved by scribes who treated their work with an almost fanatical precision, counting individual letters and lines to guard against even the smallest slip of the pen, because to them this was very far from an ordinary book. And then, in 1947, came one of the great archaeological discoveries of the modern age. In a set of caves near the Dead Sea, a hidden collection of ancient scrolls was found, tucked away and untouched for around 2,000 years, including that nearly complete copy of Isaiah mentioned earlier. When scholars carefully compared these copies, a full 1,000 years older than anything previously available to them, against the versions that had been faithfully passed down through the generations, they matched almost perfectly. It was powerful confirmation that the words being read today are, to a truly remarkable degree, the very same words that were first written down all those long centuries ago. There is also the related question of how these particular 39 books came to be gathered together and recognized as a single collection in the first place. deliberately set apart from the many other writings drifting around the ancient world. This was not a sudden decision made in a single afternoon by a committee, but a long, gradual process of recognition as communities came over time to regard certain texts as carrying genuine and lasting authority while quietly setting others to one side. The three-part shape of the Hebrew arrangement we noted at the very beginning, the law, then the prophets, then the writings, reflects roughly the order in which these groups of books settled firmly into place. By the time our silent centuries were well underway, the collection had largely taken on the shape we would still recognize today, which leaves just one last tantalizing gap to explain, and it is the strangest feature of all. When the Old Testament falls silent at the close of Malachi, and when the New Testament eventually picks the story back up, there is a span of roughly 400 years sitting quietly in between the two, a stretch often called simply the silent years. It is not that nothing whatsoever happened during those 4 centuries, quite the opposite, in fact, since the entire world was utterly transformed in the interval. It is simply that no new prophetic voice was added to this particular collection during that time, leaving a dramatic 400-year intermission hanging right before the climax, which is very possibly the longest and most suspenseful pause in all of literature, and what a remarkably busy silence it turned out to be. During those centuries, the great imperial baton we tracked earlier changed hands yet again. Persia, the empire that had graciously allowed the exiles to go home, was itself overrun by the lightning conquest of Alexander the Great, who spread the Greek language and Greek culture right across the entire region in a matter of years. After Alexander, control of that little land caught in the middle became a prize squabbled over endlessly by his quarreling successors, and at one point a heavy-handed attempt to stamp out the nation's faith altogether and force foreign customs upon it sparked a fierce and genuinely improbable uprising, led by a family remembered as the Maccabees, who managed to win a hard-fought stretch of independence against the odds. In time, though, a new and even greater power rose in the West and swallowed the whole region whole, Rome, whose iron grip would go on to define the world into which the New Testament finally opens. During these very same centuries, with the temple no longer standing as the single center of religious life, local gathering places for prayer and the reading of Scripture, the synagogues, quietly took root and spread everywhere. And the Scriptures themselves were carefully translated out of Hebrew and into Greek, in a landmark version known as the Septuagint, making these ancient texts suddenly accessible to a whole wide world that now spoke the common language of Alexander. That Greek version would go on to become the very form in which countless people first encountered these scriptures, and the one that a great many later writers would quote from directly, which made the humble work of translation far more consequential than a mere convenience. All of this upheaval did something important to the people living through it. It steadily sharpened their longing. Ground down under one foreign ruler after another, many of them began to pore over the old prophecies with fresh and growing urgency, watching for the promised deliverer more intently than any generation before them ever had. Different groups gradually formed, holding very different ideas about what that deliverer would actually look like when he came, some hoping fervently for a warrior king to throw off Rome by force, others expecting something quieter and harder to define. Expectation hung thick in the air by the close of these centuries, a whole people leaning forward and scanning the horizon, waiting for someone, anyone, who matched the scattered portrait the prophets had spent so long drawing. The silence, in other words, was anything but calm. So by the time those 4 silent centuries have at last fully run their course, the stage has been set with almost theatrical precision. The messianic portrait has been completely sketched out, scattered across the books, yet unmistakably whole. The great chain of promises has been laid down link by link, straining visibly toward a fulfillment it never quite reaches. A single common language now blankets the known world, ready and waiting to carry a message swiftly to every corner of it. Rome has laid down its long roads and imposed its uneasy, watchful peace. And a people, having somehow endured slavery, conquest, exile, and a long-awaited return, now sits waiting, more expectantly and more anxiously than ever before, for the one who had been promised in the very first pages of all. Everything is ready, everything is finally in place. And yet, for all of that, the promised king has still not actually come. The Old Testament ends, quite deliberately and quite maddeningly, on exactly that unbearable cliffhanger, the arrow drawn all the way back on the string, the whole enormous story leaning forward on tiptoe, waiting breathlessly for a curtain that has stubbornly refused to rise. The promise made across 1,000 years and 39 separate books hangs there in the air, unfulfilled but trembling on the very edge of fulfillment. And it is precisely there, at that breathless, suspended moment of pure anticipation, with the entire ancient world quietly holding its breath, that the New Testament turns to its first page, and the next chapter of the whole story finally, at very long last, begins.